The diner had been on Route 64 long enough that nobody remembered what it had been called when it opened. The sign above the door had rusted through in 3 places, and whatever letters had once spelled something hopeful were now just shapes beneath the oxidation. People in Millhaven, Tennessee called it Ray's because a man named Ray had owned it for 22 years before his daughter took over, and the name stuck the way names stick in small towns. Not because anyone decided to keep it, but because nobody decided to change it. It was a Tuesday in August, close to 9 in the evening, when the Harley came off the highway. The sound arrived before the headlight did, a low, rolling compression that came up through the asphalt and into the floor of the diner, before the engine even cut the kind of sound that certain machines make when they have been running hard and long and are finally allowed to stop. Connie Pruitt, who had worked the evening shift at Ray's for 11 years, looked up from the counter where she was refilling the sugar dispensers and watched through the rain-streaked window as the rider swung off the bike in the parking lot. She had seen bikers stop here before. Weekend riders and fresh leather men who came in groups and talked too loud and left good tips and wanted their picture taken by the gas pumps. She had never thought twice about those men. This was not one of those men. He stood in the gravel for a moment before moving. Even through the smeared glass and the yellow wash of the parking lot lights, Connie could see the difference, the way he carried himself. The particular set of his shoulders that suggested he had been holding something for a very long time and had simply learned to hold it as a neutral position rather than an effort. The leather cut he wore over a black thermal was not new. It had the quality of old saddle leather, dark and shaped by years of weather and pressure, softened in the places where it moved most and hardened everywhere else. On the back, a pair of crossed iron chains over a split road, and above that in faded gold thread, Black Iron MC, below a bottom rocker. Tennessee. He pushed through this door without hurrying. The bell above the frame gave its small sound and the diner went quiet. Not the polite quiet of people lowering their voices, but the sudden involuntary quiet of a room that had collectively decided without discussion to make itself smaller and wait. Colt Briggs was 6'2" of what happened when a hard life and a deliberate man occupied the same body for 41 years. His face was the kind of face that geography makes rather than genetics. The jaw, heavy, the brow low. A nose that had been broken at least twice and reset once. A scar ran from the corner of his left eye toward the hairline in a thin, pale line that disappeared into close-cropped dark hair, going gray at the temples. His hands were the hands of a man who had worked with them, knuckles mapped with old injuries. A faded tattoo across the back of the right one that might once have been a word and was now mostly shapes worn smooth by time. Military ink climbed both forearms beneath the rolled thermal sleeves unit numerals, and eagles faded to blue-gray. He stood inside the door for 2 seconds, scanning the room the way a man scans a room when he has learned that every room needs to be understood before he can be comfortable in it. Booth by booth, counter to kitchen window. Exits noted, faces cataloged without lingering on any one of them. Then he crossed the floor toward the far end of the counter boots, sounding against the warped wood planking in that unhurried, deliberate way, and every conversation in the diner resumed just slightly too quickly as he passed. He took a stool at the far end away from the 2 other customers nursing coffee in the middle and set his helmet on the stool beside him with the unspoken logic of a man who understood personal space as a survival tool rather than a preference. He unzipped his vest halfway. His shoulders dropped a fraction. The first visible thing about him that suggested he was tired. Connie brought the coffee without being asked. She always did for solo riders who came in late. It was a small mercy she extended without thinking about it, the kind of thing 11 years of reading people across a counter teaches you to do automatically. She set the mug down and watched him wrap both hands around it. "Kitchen's open till 10, she said. "Menu's on the board." He looked at the chalkboard above the pass-through window. Looked back at the mug. Just this, 2 words. Voice like gravel shifting at the bottom of a riverbed, low and unhurried, carrying the particular flatness of a man who had learned somewhere along the way that most words were overhead he could not afford. Connie nodded and moved off. She understood those 2 words the way 11 years of diner work teaches you to understand things. He was not there for food. He was not there for conversation. He was there because the road had gotten too long and the dark had gotten too heavy, and this was the next lit window. Colt drank his coffee slowly. Around him, the diner settled back into its ordinary noise. The clink of fork against ceramic. The low muttering of a television bolted into the upper corner, showing local weather on mute, with the captions running. The soft squeak of the back door swinging on its hinge when someone moved through the kitchen. Rain had begun tapping against the window sometime in the last hour and was building now, irregular and sharp the way August rain comes in Tennessee, sudden and absolute. Like a decision that has already been made. He was not thinking about the rain. He was not thinking about much at all, which was the specific kind of not thinking that takes enormous effort to maintain. 6 hours on the highway with wind and engine noise, as the only company in the mind either comes completely alive with everything you have been running from, or it goes mercifully, temporarily blank. Colt had learned over years of forcing the second outcome exactly how long that blankness lasted after he stopped writing. It was already beginning to fray at the edges. He refilled his own coffee from the carafe Connie had left within reach, a small gesture of trust that he noted without comment, and watched the rain streak down the window glass and let the blankness hold a little longer. That was when he heard the booth creak, not the large creak of someone sliding in, the small creak of someone already sitting there who had shifted their weight. He turned not quickly and looked over his shoulder. Booth 9, last booth in the row, pushed back against the wall where the overhead light had burned out and nobody had gotten around to replacing it. The dimmest corner in the diner. A child was sitting there alone. He turned back to his coffee. Kids in diners at 9 in the evening on a Tuesday were not unusual. Maybe the mother was in the restroom. He took another sip, watched the weather map on the television update, listened to the rain. 30 seconds passed. He looked again, still alone, and now he looked more carefully. The child was watching him, not the nervous, stolen glance that children usually gave to strangers. Direct, still, patient in a way that no 7-year-old should be patient in the way of a person who had learned that waiting was the only option consistently available. 7 was his rough estimate, small even for 7. Pale eyes, the color of winter sky, catching what little light reached that corner of the booth and holding it without blinking. Dark hair that might have been brushed that morning and had not been touched since. An oversized gray hoodie, adult-sized, hanging off one thin shoulder with the drawstring pulled tight, so her face emerged from it in a small, serious oval. On the table in front of her, nothing. No food, no drink, no phone, no coloring book, no toy. None of the things children carried to fill the time. Just her hands folded on the table, and those pale eyes watching him with something he could not immediately name. He turned back to his coffee. The booth creaked again. Different this time. The sound of someone sliding out. He heard small footsteps on the wood floor, and then the seat beside him at the counter shifted, and he looked down, and the child was standing there looking at the stool with his helmet on it. She looked at the stool, looked up at him, looked at the stool again with a deliberate patience that was asking a question without asking it. Colt moved the helmet to his other side. She climbed onto the stool with the careful, self-managed effort of a kid who was accustomed to doing things without assistance, arranged herself so her feet dangled above the floor, and folded her hands on the counter in front of her in exactly the same position they had been on the table. Like a habit, like folding her hands was something she did so they would stay still. The silence held for almost a full minute. Then she spoke. "You're not scared of my dad." It was not a question. It was an observation delivered with the flat certainty of a child who had studied adults carefully enough to understand what fear looked like and was making note of its absence. Colt looked down at her. "I don't know your dad. He comes in here sometimes," she said. "People get quiet when he comes in too." He said nothing. "But different quiet," she added. She seemed to be working something out, comparing the two silences in her head with an analytical precision that sat wrong on a face that young. "When you came in," she said, "they got quiet because they didn't know what you do. When he comes in," she stopped, refolded her hands. "They already know." Colt looked at her for a long moment. He had been in rooms his entire adult life where people went quiet when he entered. He had learned to read those silences the way a sailor reads weather, by the specific quality of them, by what they contained and what they withheld. What she was describing was something he understood precisely, and the fact that she understood it too at 7 years old and could articulate the distinction between the two kinds told him something specific about how she had been spending her time. She had been paying very close attention to the adults around her for a very long time, because attention was what she had instead of safety. The rain against the windows intensified by several degrees. Lightning somewhere behind the tree line turned the sky white for a half second, and in that fraction of a moment, the angle of light changed, and Colt saw something he had not been able to see before. The edge of her sleeve. The hoodie was adult-sized and the cuffs had slipped back slightly when she climbed onto the stool. On the inside of her left forearm, just above the wrist, there was a bruise. Not the vague greenish mark of a child who had walked into a doorframe, an elongated bruise. The particular and deliberate shape of fingers. He looked away from it immediately, not because he had not seen it, because the looking itself felt like it could frighten her. He picked up his coffee mug with both hands and drank. "What's your name?" he asked. "Nora." "How old are you, Nora?" "7. A pause and 3/4. He nodded slowly. "Where's your mom?" The silence that followed had weight to it. It settled between them on the counter like something placed there on purpose. When she finally answered, it was with the specific flatness of a child who had answered this question before and understood that the answer never made anything better. She left. Then before he could say anything, 2 years ago. Connie appeared from the kitchen side of the counter and stopped when she saw Nora sitting there. Something moved through her expression, recognition first, and then something more complicated. Something that landed between sympathy and a careful practiced blankness. The blankness of a person who had made a decision about how much to engage with a particular situation and was holding that decision firmly in place. "Honey," Connie said, "does your daddy know you're sitting there?" "He's at the auto shop," Nora said. "He said to stay in the booth till he got back." Connie looked at Colt. There was something in the look that might have been the beginning of an apology. Then she moved off toward the register, and Colt heard her say nothing to nobody. Nora was watching him again. "He puts medicine in my food," she said, "so I sleep." The words were quiet, nearly swallowed by the rain and the television and the ambient kitchen noise. But Colt heard them with a clarity that had nothing to do with volume. He heard them the way you hear something when every other sound in the world suddenly stops mattering. He set his coffee down very carefully, set it down and left his hands around the mug and looked at the counter and did not move. The girl was still watching him, those pale eyes tracking his face with the patient, exhausted attentiveness of a child who had said these words before, perhaps not out loud, perhaps only in the darkness of some small room over and over in the specific hours before sleep, and was now watching to see whether this time would be different from all the other times. Whether this time would mean anything at all. Colt kept his voice even. He had learned that the voice was a tool, and the first rule of the tool was that raising it helped nothing. "How long has he been doing that?" he asked. She considered. "Since school got out." "Does anyone know?" Her expression did not change, but something behind it shifted, a shadow of something that in an adult would have been called bitterness, but on a 7-year-old face had no name that fit precisely. "My teacher," she said. "Miss Cross. She called somebody. A lady came to the house." "What happened when the lady came?" "Daddy made pancakes. He was really nice. She wrote things on a clipboard, and then she left." Colt was quiet for a long moment. He thought about what it meant that a woman had come with a clipboard and left with nothing changed. He thought about the specific bureaucratic architecture required to make that happen. A complaint filed, a visit scheduled, an outcome managed. And after she left, he asked. Nora looked down at her folded hands. She did not answer. She did not need to. And Colt, who had spent years carrying the specific weight of what it felt like to say, "I told somebody," and have it mean nothing at all, understood the silence completely. He understood it in the way that certain silences can only be understood by people who have lived inside the same one. He reached over slowly, slowly enough that she could see the motion coming and make any choice she wanted about it. He set his hand flat on the counter beside hers, not touching, just there. "Okay," he said. It was not a promise. It was not absolution. It was a word that meant, "I hear you." That meant I am not going anywhere. That meant you did nothing wrong by telling me. Nora looked at his hand for a moment. Then she looked up at him. "You're not going to call somebody," she said. Not a question. The tone of someone preemptively removing the hope so it could not be taken from her later. "No," Colt said. Something shifted barely in her expression. "What are you going to do?" He had no answer to that yet. He was 41 years old with a felony on his record and a motorcycle club patch on his back, and a history of being exactly the kind of person that law enforcement, social services, and the decent citizens of every small town in Tennessee would collectively dismiss and dismiss again. He had no authority here, no legal standing of any kind. What he had was two hands and a particular slow-burning clarity that came to a man when he had run out of things to lose. "I'm going to finish my coffee," he said, "and you're going to stay on that stool until I do." It was not an answer, but it was the first thing anyone had said to Nora Hayes in a very long time that felt like solid ground beneath her feet. Then the door at the far end of the diner swung open. A man walked in, shaking rain from his jacket, scanning the room with the automatic territorial sweep of someone who treated every space he entered as a space that already belonged to him. Mid-40s, clean-shaved, the kind of face arranged in the particular configuration of a man who smiled often and meant it rarely. The muscles that made the smile were there, practiced and ready, but the eyes above them were running different calculations entirely. He found Nora in 3 seconds. His gaze moved from her to Colt and stayed there. The smile that appeared was the smile he would have worn if he found a stranger sitting in his living room. "There she is," Boyd Weston said. His voice was warm and easy. "Sorry if she bothered you, brother." The word chosen deliberately. The tone of it man to man, constructed to establish something. Shared language, equivalence. "We are the same kind of people, you and I. Just 2 guys in a diner on a rainy night." Colt looked at him across the counter. Did not smile, did not move. Let the silence do what silence does when you do not fill it. Boyd's smile held, but something around its edges tightened by the smallest degree. "Nora, come on, sweetheart. Let's go home." Nora slid off the stool. She did not look at Colt when she did it. She looked straight ahead, the hood of the oversized sweatshirt still framing her face in its small, serious oval, her hands disappearing back inside the 2 long sleeves. But as she moved around the counter toward Boyd, she glanced back once. Fast. The way you check a landmark when you are leaving a place you might need to find again. Colt watched Boyd put his hand on the back of Nora's neck lightly, in the way that looks like affection and functions like ownership, and walk her toward the door. He watched Boyd push the door open with his shoulder and let the storm take them both. He sat with his coffee for 30 seconds. The diner had gone quiet again, but differently. The quality of a room that had collectively exhaled, that had watched something and looked away from it and was now returning deliberately to its own business. Colt turned and looked at Connie. Connie was wiping down the counter 3 feet away. She did not look up. "How long?" Colt asked. The cloth moved in slow circles. "How long has she been coming in here alone?" Connie stopped wiping. She set both palms flat on the counter and looked at some middle distance that was not Colt and not the wall. "I called the county line," she said, 8 months ago. Her voice was flat, the voice of someone reporting a fact that had already been resolved against them. "They sent somebody. Boyd coaches youth baseball. He's at First Baptist every Sunday morning. The volunteer coordinator," she stopped, started again differently. Nothing came of it. Colt nodded slowly. "What am I supposed to do?" Connie said. And the question had no performance in it. It was not defensive. It was not rhetorical. It was the genuinely exhausted question of a woman who had tried the thing she was supposed to try and had learned what trying cost when the system had already made up its mind. "I already tried," she said. "I got nowhere. I am one person with no power inside something that has already decided." Colt pulled 2 20s from the inside pocket of his vest and set them under his empty mug. He stood. He zipped his vest. He put his helmet under his arm. "Nothing yet," he said. He walked to the door and pushed out into the storm. The rain hit him immediately, soaking his hair flat against his skull, running down the back of his neck into his collar. The August heat that had been sitting over Millhaven all day was gone now, replaced by the particular cold that comes with a hard rain, the kind that arrives fast and stays until it decides to leave. He stood at his Harley and let the water come and looked in the direction Boyd Weston's taillights had gone. Then he thought about Aaron. He did not mean to. He rarely did it deliberately. But standing in a parking lot in the rain with the image of a 7-year-old girl being walked out a door by a man whose hand on her neck meant something specific, standing with the knowledge of what she had told him and what it meant and what the sound of someone being failed looked like. From the inside, he could not stop it from coming. Aaron Briggs had been 17 years old. Colt had been 24. Old enough to know better, young enough to believe that knowing better was the same as doing better. He had been out with the club that night, a run-up to Knoxville and back, the kind of night that started as one thing and became another, the kind of night that seemed in the moment like a thing that could wait until morning. He had told himself Aaron was fine. Aaron had always seemed fine. Quiet, maybe. Withdrawn from certain things, but fine. He had told himself this with the particular confidence of someone who needed it to be true and had confused that need with evidence. In the morning, their mother had called, and Colt had sat in a gas station parking lot outside Knoxville with his phone in his hand and learned what silence actually contained when you had not been paying close enough attention to hear it. He had learned that the shape of a person's quiet could be either ordinary or desperate, and that from the outside, if you were not looking with enough care, the two were almost identical. He had been reading the shape of certain silences wrong his entire adult life after that, recalibrating, going back through memory and understanding which ones had been trying to tell him something and which ones had just been quiet, learning to sit with the distinction. The shape of Nora's silence in that diner booth, the careful way she had folded her hands, the specific quality of patience in her eyes, not the patience of a child waiting for something good to happen, but the patience of a child who had stopped expecting anything good and was simply managing the time until the next thing occurred. He had recognized that shape. He was not going to look away from it. He got his phone out. One contact, no name above it, just a string of digits he knew without looking. It rang twice. "You in Millhaven," said the voice on the other end. "Yeah." A pause. Wind on the other end of the line, the sound of somewhere far away, watching a different piece of the same dark sky. "How long you staying?" Colt looked down the wet highway in the direction Boyd Weston's taillights had disappeared. "Longer than I planned," he said. He hung up. He stood in the rain. He did not move for a full minute. Then he reached into the side bag on his Harley and found a cigarette and lit it despite the rain, cupping it carefully with both hands, and smoked it down to the filter in the parking lot of Ray's Diner while the storm moved over Millhaven, Tennessee, like something that had been building for a long time and had finally decided to arrive. In his chest, beneath the leather and the years and the scar tissue and the practiced stillness, something was waking up, something he had spent a very long time working to keep from waking. The cigarette died. He crushed it under his boot. His phone buzzed once, a text, no sender name, 4 words. "How many you need?" Colt stared at the screen for a moment, rain drumming on his helmet, lightning fracturing the sky to the east, the whole dark Tennessee night pressing in from every direction. He started typing. 7 words. "Millhaven, Tennessee, 1 child, need eyes, how many?" He sent it to a single number. That number forwarded to others. Those numbers forwarded to however many they forwarded to. And Colt did not track the chain because he never needed to. The chain had its own logic built over 15 years of late nights and courthouse steps and hospital waiting rooms. And it moved the way water moves through cracked ground, finding every available path, filling every space unstoppable. Not because of any single force, but because of accumulated weight. He pulled the truck up from the motel lot 2 blocks down where he had left it. An old F25, the color of dried clay, with the passenger seat permanently reclined, because the spring was gone and he had never gotten around to replacing it. He parked at the far end of the lot and watched the diner lights through the rain-blurred windshield and waited. Hatch Carver called 12 minutes later. Not a text, a call, because Hatch did not text when something mattered. Colt picked up on the first ring. "You see my message," Colt said. "I saw it." Hatch's voice had the quality of a room that has been cleared of furniture to make space for something more serious. "Tell me what you have." Colt told him. Not everything, not the way Nora's hands had sat folded on the counter, or the specific quality of how she had looked back at him when she left. Those things he kept, not because they were not important, but because they were too important, and putting them into words for someone else's ears felt like opening something that needed to stay closed until he understood it himself. He told Hatch the structure of it, the girl, the diner, what Nora had said, what Connie had said about the county line call and the clipboard woman in First Baptist and 8 months of nothing. Hatch listened without interrupting. That was the thing about Hatch. He listened the way a man listens when he understands that the information has already cost someone something to carry, and interrupting would be a kind of theft. When Colt finished, the line was quiet for 4 seconds. Boyd Weston Hatch said, "You get anything else on him?" "Shop name off the jacket he was wearing," Colt said. "Weston Auto, 2 blocks off Main." Another pause. The sound of wind through a phone speaker, Hatch somewhere outside, standing still thinking. "I'm 4 hours out," Hatch said. "I'm not asking you to come," Colt said. Colt. Just the name. Flat. Final. The tone Hatch used when he was declining to have an argument about something he had already decided. 4 hours. Don't do anything that can't be undone before I get there. I'm parked outside a diner in the rain, Hatch. Yeah, a beat. That's how it starts. The line went dead. Colt set the phone on the dash and watched the rain and let those 4 words sit where they had landed. That's how it starts, because Hatch knew. Hatch had been there 12 years ago in Decatur, Alabama, when Colt had also been parked outside a building in the rain, also holding a phone, also telling himself he was just watching. He had been there for the 3 weeks that followed, and he had been in the courtroom for the sentencing, and he had been waiting at the gate with the truck the day Colt walked out of Holman Correctional after serving 2 years on a charge that he had never discussed publicly, including with Hatch. Hatch knew exactly how it started. Colt also knew how it started. That was the problem. He drove around Millhaven instead of sitting still the way he always drove in a new place. Not sightseeing, reading. The way the road had taught him to read towns, the courthouse, the sheriff's substation, one cruiser out front, engine running, the particular stillness of a station that was present but not alert. The blocks of Main Street with their mix of open and shuttered storefronts. First Baptist with its big parking lot and its electric marquee sign, and the kind of building that spoke of a congregation with money and organization. The baseball diamond behind the elementary school, and on the east edge of town a strip of mechanic bays and body shops. One of them with a hand-painted sign, Weston Auto, visible even through the rain. The bays rolled down for the night, a floodlight buzzing over the door. He drove past once slowly, noted the truck in the lot, the make and partial plate. Boyd's truck, he was certain enough. Noted the apartment complex through the tree line behind the shop. Low buildings, external staircases. A place built for people who needed somewhere inexpensive and did not have other options. He drove back to the motel and sat in the parking lot for a while. Then he went inside and lay down on the bed with his boots on and did not sleep. He thought about Nora. He thought about the specific way she had climbed onto the counter stool with that careful, self-managed effort, the effort of a kid who had learned not to ask for help because asking for help introduced variables she could not control. He thought about her hands folded on the counter. He thought about the words she had used. Medicine said so flatly, the way you say a word when you have said it enough times internally that it has lost the surface weight but not the actual weight. The actual weight is still there. It has just gone somewhere deeper and quieter. He thought about his mother calling from Knoxville. He thought about Aaron. He lay on the motel bed and breathed and did not sleep and waited for morning and for Hatch and for whatever came after the decision he had already made without fully admitting to himself that he had made it. Outside, the storm moved over Millhaven in long, slow waves, and the rain on the roof of the Budget Inn sounded like something patient and insistent, the kind of sound that does not stop, because you want it to, that simply continues because it has its own logic and its own timeline and does not consult yours. Hatch arrived at 6:47 in the morning. Colt heard the Harley from the parking lot and was already standing in the doorway of his room with 2 coffees from the machine down the hall when Hatch cut the engine. Hatch Carver rode a stripped, flat black Road King with no windshield and saddlebags worn to the point of looking structural rather than decorative. He was 53 years old and built like someone had assembled a man from fence posts and then let the weather work on him for a decade. Tall and angular and weathered with a gray beard, kept short and precise, and eyes so pale they read as almost colorless, which was one of several things about Hatch that people found instinctively unsettling before he said a word. He took the coffee without greeting, drank half of it, standing up, and looked at Colt over the rim of the cup. "Show me the diner," he said. They drove separately and parked on the street in the early morning when Route 64 was empty and the humidity was already building toward the day's punishment. Ray's was not open yet, closed sign turned in the glass, but the lights were on and back, and they could see Connie moving through the kitchen in the dim interior. Hatch studied the building, the lot, the sight lines. Then he looked at Colt. "Your read on the woman inside," he said. "She called county services 8 months ago and got nowhere," Colt said. "She's not indifferent. She's defeated." "That's a different thing." "Yeah," Hatch said. "It is." He drank his coffee. A pickup truck rumbled down Route 64, and neither of them tracked it. "The sheriff's office," Hatch said. "1 cruiser overnight," Colt said. "Didn't look undermanned, looked uninterested. Town this size, Boyd Weston coaches youth baseball and goes to church every week. He's not a nobody, he has social capital. And the system runs on social capital," Hatch said. "Not a question." The flat tone of a man confirming something he already knew and was tired of having confirmed. "Yeah," Colt said. They stood in the early morning outside the closed diner, and the heat was already finding them through their jackets, and the day was going to be brutal. and neither of them said anything for almost a full minute. Then Hatch said, "What do you need from me?" And Colt told him. He had driven 6 hours before stopping at Millhaven, and the 6 hours before that had been something else entirely, the specific geography of a man trying to put enough road between himself and the week prior, that the week prior would stop feeling like something he was still inside. The week had involved a man in Knoxville named Garrett Pyle, who had been doing things to his girlfriend's daughter for long enough that the daughter had learned to sleep facing the wall. Colt had found out through a chapter member whose sister lived in the same apartment complex. He had handled it the way he handled things these days, which meant phone calls and documentation and a conversation with a detective he trusted, followed by the slow, bureaucratic grind of due process. Due process had taken 4 months. 4 months was a long time when you were 8 years old and sleeping facing the wall. The detective had done what he could. The DA had filed. Garrett Pyle was currently sitting in Knox County awaiting trial and would probably take a plea and serve 3 years and be out before the girl finished middle school. The system had worked in the technical sense that it had eventually engaged with the problem. In every other sense, the accounting was more complicated. And Colt had spent the drive south trying to find a way to sit with the more complicated accounting that did not require him to stop the truck and do something inadvisable. 6 hours of highway had not resolved it. That was why he had not planned to stop in Millhaven. He had not planned to stop anywhere in particular. He was moving because moving was better than sitting still when the inside of his own head was the only available company. And then the Harley had needed gain and the next lit window had been Ray's Diner, and he had gone in for coffee he did not need and had found booth 9. He finished his circuit of Millhaven just after 1 in the morning and parked back at the Budget Inn and sat in the lot with the engine off and the windows down, listening to the rain ease toward its conclusion. The storm was still in the area, but moving northeast, its energy dissipating into the kind of low, steady drizzle that was almost comfortable after the hard rain of the early evening. He thought about the county line Connie had called 8 months ago. He thought about the specific human being who had received that call, had opened a file, had scheduled a visit, had driven to the Weston address, had watched Boyd Weston make pancakes with the practiced warmth of a man who had been making pancakes for clipboard visits for long enough to be good at it, had written something in the file, had driven away. Had that person known? Had they suspected and done it anyway? Or had Boyd's performance been genuinely convincing? The kind of performance that only fails under very close examination by someone who already knows what to look for. There was no way to know from the outside. There was no way to know whether the person with the clipboard was complicit or merely fooled, whether they were part of the system Dale Weston had built, or simply another person that system had used without their knowledge. Colt had learned not to assume malice when the explanation might be exhaustion. County social workers were overworked and underpaid and moved through too many cases to give any single case the kind of sustained attention that a child like Nora required. That was a failure of the system rather than necessarily a failure of any individual within it, and distinguishing between the two mattered if you were going to direct your anger somewhere useful rather than just somewhere available. He thought about that for a while, and then he went inside and lay on the bed with his boots on and watched the ceiling and did not sleep. At some point around 4 in the morning, his phone buzzed with a message from a number in the Chattanooga area code that he recognized as belonging to a man named Edgar Pruitt, who had ridden with the Black Iron MC for 20 years before a knee replacement had taken him off the bike and into a truck. Edgar's message said only "on my way," bringing 2 others. Colt lay on the bed and looked at the message and thought about Edgar Pruitt driving through the night in a truck at 4 in the morning because Colt had sent 7 words into the dark and Edgar had received them and had gotten in the truck. That was the chain. That was what it was made of. Not organization, not hierarchy, not rules. People who had decided one by one across 15 years of late nights in difficult situations that when this particular man called the call was worth answering. Because he had answered their calls, and because he had never once called unless the call was worth answering, and because the cumulative weight of that record meant that when the message came, you got in the truck or you got on the bike and you went. Colt lay on the motel bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about the specific responsibility that came with that. The weight of being someone whose calls got answered. The obligation to never abuse it, to never use it carelessly, to always be certain before the word went out, because the word going out set things in motion. that had their own momentum and their own consequences and could not be called back once they were moving. He was certain. He had been certain from the moment Nora Hayes said so. I sleep in the flat, exhausted voice of a child who had run out of the energy required to make the terrible thing sound terrible. He was still certain at 4 in the morning in a budget inn in Millhaven, Tennessee, lying on a bed with his boots on, watching the ceiling, waiting for morning. Certain was not the same as easy. He had learned that a long time ago in a gas station parking lot outside Knoxville, and he had been relearning it in various forms ever since. Rex Donovan arrived at 2 in the afternoon in a silver crew cab truck with a cracked windshield and a road atlas on the dash that he had owned since before GPS existed and refused to replace on principle. He was 60 years old and the president of the Black Iron MC Tennessee chapter, which meant he was simultaneously the most and least imposing man in any room he entered. Less physically overwhelming than Colt, less coldly precise than Hatch, but carrying something in his bearing that both of them lacked. Authority that did not come from size or reputation, but from history. From having navigated 17 years of the particular minefield that came with running an organization of damaged, fiercely loyal, volatile men and keeping it pointed towards something other than self-destruction. He had a gray braid down his back and reading glasses in his vest pocket, and he wore his cut with the quiet permanence of a man who had stopped thinking about it the same way he had stopped thinking about his own skin. He shook Colt's hand in the motel parking lot and said nothing for a moment, just looking at him. "Hatch fill you in?" Colt asked. "Hatch gave me the structure," Rex said. "I want to hear it from you." Colt told him. This time he told him everything. The way Nora's hands had sat folded on the counter. The specific shape of the bruise on her forearm. The quality of silence in the diner when Boyd Weston walked in, and how it differed from the silence when Colt himself had entered, and why that difference mattered in ways that were difficult to articulate, but impossible to ignore once you had seen it. Rex listened with his arms crossed and his eyes on the middle distance. He was a man who listened with his whole body, not as performance but as genuine practice. The way someone listens when they understand that the details are the story, that the headline tells you nothing, and the specific texture of what actually happened tells you everything. When Colt finished, Rex said the waitress, "Connie Pruitt." "Yeah, she'll talk to us. She talked to me." Rex looked at him with the particular expression of a man who has just made a distinction the other person has not yet made. "That's different from talking to us," he said. "In a motel parking lot." "I know." Rex unfolded his arms and put his hands in his pockets, a gesture Colt recognized as his thinking posture, the visible signal that he was processing rather than responding. "I need documentation, Colt. I cannot move people on one conversation in a diner." "How many are we talking about?" Colt asked. Rex looked at him steadily. "I made some calls this morning, after Hatch called me at midnight. Because I know you and I know when Hatch calls me at midnight that the number I am going to need is not going to be 20. He paused. "There is an operation in Murfreesboro that does exactly this kind of work. Documentation, witness coordination, case building. A man named Hargrove runs it. I have worked with him twice before. He knows how to build something that does not fall apart under the first legal challenge." Colt stared at him. "You called Hargrove before you even got in the truck?" "Before I got in the truck, yes." Rex met his eyes without apology. "Because the goal is not to make Boyd Weston afraid for one night. The goal is to make sure Nora Hayes does not spend the next decade in courtrooms while a lawyer points at a motorcycle club and calls the whole thing a harassment campaign." His voice dropped half a register. "You understand me?" Colt understood him completely. He nodded. "Good," Rex said. He pulled out his phone, turned the screen toward Colt. "Hargrove already has something. School records. Filed reports, 3 of them. A medical examination at Vanderbilt Children's 8 months ago. Bruising on her ribs. The ER physician flagged it and filed a report." Colt looked at the screen. "Nothing happened," Rex said quietly, "because the report went to a county desk that is managed by a man who has known Boyd Weston his entire life." He put his phone away. "So now we are not moving on one conversation. We are moving on a pattern, and that is the difference between something that holds in court and something that gets dismissed and used against her." Hatch was leaning against his Road King 10 feet away, arms folded, silent throughout the exchange. Now he spoke without moving. "He's right," Hatch said. Colt said nothing. He looked at the sky. He breathed. He was thinking about Nora climbing off the counter stool with that careful, self-managed effort. About her walking toward Boyd with her hands disappearing back into the too long sleeves. About the fact that She was somewhere in this town right now, in that apartment behind the shop, or at school, or wherever she was, with no way of knowing whether the man at the counter was different from the clipboard woman, or whether this was just another time that nothing came of it. How long does Hargrove need? Colt asked. 24 hours for a preliminary package, Rex said. 48 to be solid. She does not have 48 hours. The silence after that was the specific silence of three men who all understood he was correct. Rex looked at him for a long moment. Then he reached into his vest pocket and came out with a folded piece of paper and handed it to Colt without a word. Colt unfolded it. A printed photograph, low resolution, taken with a phone camera. A man in a baseball cap loading a box into the trunk of a gray sedan in what appeared to be a parking lot adjacent to a building with institutional signage visible in the background. The timestamp in the lower corner was from 6 weeks prior. What am I looking at? Colt said. Hargrove has a contact in the Millhaven school system, Rex said. A teacher named Miriam Cross. She has been documenting on her own without authorization for 3 months. She took that photograph because she saw Nora arrive at school that morning and could not sit with what she saw. She called Hargrove herself last week. She's been waiting for someone to answer. Colt looked at the photograph, the man loading the box, the timestamp. Something cold and precise settled into his chest. Who is the man in the photo, he asked. Rex's expression did not change. That is what Hargrove is still working on. He paused. Because it is not Boyd Weston. The words landed at the parking lot of the Millhaven Budget Inn on a Tuesday afternoon in August, and they sat there in the heat between three men, and none of them spoke for a long time. Not Boyd Weston, which meant the man Colt had watched walk into the diner and put his hand on the back of Nora's neck and walk her out into the storm, the man. Every filed report pointed toward the man. The entire logic of the situation had been constructed around was not the only person in this picture, which meant the picture was larger. Which meant whatever Colt had thought, this was sitting in the rain outside Ray's diner the night before composing 7 words into the dark, whatever he had thought this was, it was not that. Hatch finally looked up from the ground. His pale eyes moved to Colt, then to Rex, then back. Who else knows about the photo? Hatch asked. Right now, Rex said us Hargrove and Miriam Cross. He paused. And whoever the man in that photo has been reporting to. The motel ice machine down the breezeway clicked on with a mechanical shutter, ran for several seconds and went silent. Somewhere out on Route 64, a semi downshifted through the overpass. The heat pressed down on the parking lot. Colt folded the photograph back along its crease and put it in his vest. I need to talk to Miriam Cross, he said. Today, before anyone else does. Rex studied him. I'll find out where she is, Rex said. I'll go alone, Colt said. Rex looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded, once the nod of a man who understood that certain conversations required a specific kind of presence, and that 3 men in leather did not constitute that presence. Colt drove to Millhaven Elementary alone at 3 in the afternoon, parked at the far end of the faculty lot, and waited. At 4:12, a woman came out the side door of the building, carrying a canvas tote bag and a plastic crate of manila folders, navigating both with the practiced management of someone who had been doing this particular balancing act for many years. She was in her mid-40s with close-cropped natural hair and the kind of face that had trained itself over a long period of time to pay attention to things other people had decided were not worth noticing. She wore sensible shoes and a cotton blouse that had been pressed that morning and now showed the soft exhaustion of a full school day. She was unlocking a 10-year-old Civic with a dented rear quarter panel when Colt got out of the truck. She heard his boots on the asphalt and turned completely quickly, fully facing the sound without flinching. The turn of a woman who did not frighten easily. She looked at him, looked at the truck, looked back at him. Mr. Briggs, she said. The flatness of it stopped him 2 steps from her car. His name said without question or surprise. Hargrove called me 20 minutes ago, she said before he could ask. She studied him the way a teacher studies someone she has already formed a preliminary assessment of and is now testing against reality. He said to trust you. I do not know you well enough for that yet. But I am talking to you, which is more than I am doing with most people in this town. Colt looked at her. What did you see the morning you took that photograph? Something moved through her expression, a shadow pressing against the professional composure from the inside. She set the plastic crate down on the hood of the Civic and looked at it for a moment. Nora came in on a Wednesday, she said. 6 weeks ago, she was wearing a long-sleeve shirt in the middle of August. She paused. I pulled her aside before homeroom. I told her I liked her shirt, asked where she got it. She said her daddy gave it to her. I asked if I could see her arms, but I showed her mine first, told her I had gotten sunburned on my forearms over the weekend, asked if hers hurt too. The flatness of her voice as she described the approach, the careful, methodical gentleness of it, was more difficult to hear than anger would have been. She showed me, Miriam said, both arms and her collarbone, and there was something wrong with the way she was moving. Careful, compensating. Children with bruised ribs move a specific way, and after 12 years of this work, you learn to recognize it. Colt said nothing. He let her take the time she needed. I walked her to the nurse's office and called county services from my classroom phone during my prep period. Then I went out to the parking lot at lunch to get something from my car. That was when I saw him. She looked up at Colt, a man I did not recognize coming out of the administration building. Not Boyd Weston. I know what Boyd Weston looks like. This man was older. He was wearing a county lanyard, the kind that child services people wear, and he was on his phone walking fast. He got into a gray sedan. You took the photograph, Colt said. I tried to get the plate, she said. He was already pulling out. I got him loading a box into the trunk before he got in. That is what Hargrove has. Colt looked at her steadily. You ran the plate through Hargrove. I could not read the full plate. Hargrove worked with the partial. She picked up the crate from the car hood and held it against her chest. The sedan is registered to the Harlan County Department of Child and Family Services. Harlan County is 3 counties over. Not local jurisdiction. Whatever that man was doing in our administration building, he was not there in any official Millhaven capacity. Someone brought him in specifically. The lot was emptying around them, the last bus pulling away from the entrance, the procession of parent cars thinning. Somewhere across the street, a dog was barking with the repetitive insistence of an animal that had been at it for a long time and had stopped expecting it to resolve anything. Colt stood in the teacher's parking lot and let the information reorganize everything he thought he understood about the situation. A man from Harlan County Child Services, 3 counties away, in Millhaven's elementary school administration building on the same morning Nora had come to school, showing bruising on both arms. Loading something into a trunk, leaving fast. Not investigating, containing. Someone had called him in. Someone in this town with enough reach to contact a specific county services employee 3 jurisdictions away and ask him to come in and quietly close a file before it could travel any farther. Someone with social capital that extended past the Millhaven city limits into the county government infrastructure of the entire region. Who has that kind of reach in this town? Colt asked. Miriam Cross looked at him. The alertness behind her eyes became something harder and more deliberate. She had the expression of a woman who had been sitting with an answer for weeks, an answer she had not been able to say out loud because saying it out loud in this town to the wrong person had consequences she could not afford. She looked around the parking lot, then back at Colt. There is a man named Dale Weston, she said. He holds no official position. He is not elected. He does not have a title. But his family has been in Millhaven for 3 generations, and he has relationships with the county commissioner, with the state district representative, with the sheriff's department. She stopped, choosing the next word carefully. Boyd Weston is his nephew. The word landed in the hot parking lot air, and Colt felt its weight move outward through everything he had constructed over the past 18 hours. Every filed report that had gone nowhere, every clipboard visit that ended with pancakes in a blank form, every ER flag that landed on the right desk with the wrong outcome. It had not been negligence. It had been management. Someone had been actively, deliberately, continuously ensuring that the machinery designed to protect Nora Hayes was redirected away from her. Does Dale Weston know about me? Colt asked. I don't know, Miriam said, but she said it in the way that meant probably. Colt looked at the empty school entrance. Where does Nora go after school today? Same as every day, Miriam said. Boyd picks her up, or someone Boyd sends does. She paused. There is a woman on her street named Ruth Calloway. 70s, no legal standing, but Nora knows her. Ruth has called the county line twice. Dale Weston knows who she is. Her voice was level, but it was a controlled leveling that required ongoing effort. Millhaven is not a large town, Mr. Briggs. Dale Weston knows everyone, and everyone in Millhaven knows to stay on the right side of Dale Weston. Colt looked at her. Until today, he said. She studied his face with a 12-year assessment of a teacher reading what was behind what was being said. Hargrove said you were bringing people, she said. Yes. How many? Enough, Colt said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she reached into the canvas tote bag and produced a sealed envelope. I have all 3 filed reports, she said. Original copies, not the county's, mine. I made copies the morning I filed each one because I did not trust the process. I have the nurse's notes from the day Nora showed me her arms. I have a written account dated and signed of everything I have observed over the past 8 months. She held the envelope out. I have been building this because I believe that one day someone would actually come, she said. Colt took the envelope. He looked at her for a moment. Give me tonight, he said. She nodded once with the precision of someone who had already made this decision and was simply waiting for the moment it became actionable. He turned back toward the truck. Mr. Briggs, she said. He stopped. Dale Weston has a son, she said. He works in the Millhaven Sheriff's Department. Deputy Chad Weston. He was on the desk the last 2 times the county line sent someone to follow up on Nora's case. Colt turned back to look at her. He is also at First Baptist, she said. Same congregation as Boyd, every Sunday. Colt stood in the parking lot and breathed. The Sheriff's Department. Not just social capital and county services reach. The actual law enforcement infrastructure of Millhaven was compromised. The cruiser he had seen outside the substation the night before engine running one deputy on the overnight desk. That deputy might be Chad Weston, or a man who owed Chad Weston something, or a man who had learned a long time ago that in Millhaven, the Weston family's preferences were a force of nature and working against them was a choice with a specific and lasting cost. He got back in the truck. Hatch was waiting in the motel parking lot when Colt returned. Rex was on the phone 15 feet away, speaking in a low voice with his back partly turned. Colt walked to Hatch and handed him the envelope without speaking. Hatch took it, felt the weight of it, looked at Colt. Miriam Cross, Colt said, 3 original filed reports, nurse's notes, 8 months of documented observations. Hatch said nothing. He held the envelope. Dale Weston, Colt said, Boyd's uncle, 3 generations in this town, relationships running from the county commissioner to the sheriff's department. His son is a deputy. The whole system that was supposed to protect Nora has been running through Dale Weston the entire time. Hatch absorbed this with the particular stillness of a man processing information that reorders a significant portion of what he thought he understood. Rex finished his call and walked over. Hargrove got the sedan, plate confirmed, Rex said. Registered to Harlan County Child and Family Services. The specific vehicle was signed out to a senior case coordinator named Aldrich. Gerald Aldrich. He has been with Harlan County for 19 years. He looked at both of them. Aldrich has a connection to Dale Weston, Rex said. They attended the same church in Harlan County 20 years ago before Aldrich transferred departments. The connection is old, but it is there. Hargrove found it in 40 minutes. Colt looked at the sky, looked back. How many confirmed, he asked Rex. Rex met his eyes. As of an hour ago, 47. Colt's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. A message from a number he did not recognize. No name, 5 words. You should leave Millhaven tonight. He looked at the timestamp, looked at Rex. When did you make your last call? Colt asked. Rex checked his phone. 40 seconds ago, he said. Why? Colt turned the screen toward him. Rex read it. His jaw tightened by 1 degree. Hatch looked at it. His pale eyes did not change expression, but the quality of his stillness became denser. The stillness of a man who had spent years in situations where movement at the wrong moment was the difference between coming home and not coming home. Someone in this town has your number, Hatch said. Someone in this town was connected to Rex's call, Colt said. 40 seconds is not enough time for information to travel far. Rex said Ray Slade is in my chain. He's based in Cookville. Hatch said quietly, Cookville is 931. Colt looked at him. Same area code as the message. He pulled out his phone and dialed Ray Slade's number. 4 rings, voicemail, Ray's voice asking for a message. Colt hung up without leaving one. He looked at the call log, call placed at 2:41 in the afternoon. He looked at the anonymous message, timestamp 2:38. Ray had sent the warning 3 minutes before Colt called him back. Ray's phone went unanswered because Ray had already done what he was going to do and was not prepared to explain it. That was its own kind of answer. Colt put his phone away and said nothing. Hatch understood. He always understood when Colt said nothing. Rex said, you think Slade sent it? I think the timing is what it is, Colt said. And I think Ray Slade has been with the Cookville chapter long enough to have connections in this part of the state that none of us have examined closely enough. He looked at Rex directly. Get Hargrove to run Ray Slade, Colt said. Full background, everything before he patched in. Rex was already reaching for his phone. That evening, Hargrove called Colt directly. Not Rex, not through an intermediary. Colt specifically because the information was specific and Hargrove understood who needed to hear it first. Colt took the call sitting in his truck outside the motel engine off windows down the Tennessee evening, pressing in with its combination of heat and insect noise and the smell of the creek that ran behind the motel property. Slade Hargrove said, without preamble, Raymond Elliott Slade, did time at Holman Correctional 12 years ago, overlapping with your own time there by 14 months. Colt had known that. Different block, Hargrove said. Different offense. He was in on a distribution charge, served 22 months released, and kept clean long enough to patch into the Cookeville chapter 6 years ago through a sponsorship from a member named Garza, who has since relocated to Florida. Colt waited. Here is what you did not know, Hargrove said. During his time at Holman, Slade shared a housing block for 7 months with a man named Garrett Weston, younger brother of Dale Weston. Garrett was serving time on a fraud conviction. He was released 4 years ago, went back to Millhaven, currently works at Weston Auto. Boyd's shop. The air in the truck cab had a particular weight to it. Colt sat with that for a moment. So Ray Slade has a connection to the Weston family that predates his time with the club, Colt said. Goes back 11 years, Hargrove said. I cannot tell you what the nature of that connection is today. I can tell you it exists, and I can tell you that when Rex made his call this afternoon, someone in that chain had reason to want you out of Millhaven before tomorrow. Colt thanked him and ended the call. He sat in the truck and worked through it. Ray Slade was not the architect of any of this. Ray was a connection point, a man who had a debt or a relationship with Garrett Weston that had survived 11 years and 2 different lives. When Rex's call moved through the chain and reached Ray, Ray had made a decision. He had warned Colt off rather than warn the club in. He had tried to protect the Westons rather than the girl. That was its own kind of information. It meant Dale Weston already knew Colt was in Millhaven, had known before the anonymous message was sent, which meant Dale had sources that ran closer to the chain than anyone had realized, sources that had been in place for years without anyone noticing. Colt got out of the truck and walked to Rex's room and knocked twice. Rex opened the door. Colt told him what Hargrove had said. Rex listened without sitting down. When Colt finished, Rex said Ray Slade needs to be pulled from the chain, right now, before any more information moves through him. Agreed, Colt said. I need you to make a call, not through the chain, direct to every confirmed rider. New instructions, no communication through Slade, no information about timeline or approach until I say. Rex nodded once. He picked up his phone and began dialing. Colt went back to his truck and sat and thought about Dale Weston, a man with no title, no elected position. 3 generations of family in a single town, which meant 3 generations of favors given and owed 3 generations of being present at every significant moment in the community's life, every business deal and every political campaign, and every crisis that required someone with connections and discretion to make a problem smaller. A man who had built an architecture of protection around his nephew's house and called it management. A man who had reached 3 counties over to bring in a specific county services employee to close a school nurse's report before it could grow legs. A man who, if he had sources inside Colt's communication chain, had been watching this situation develop from the moment Colt's first message went out the night before. And a man who, if he understood that the architecture was being examined from the outside, would not wait to see how the examination ended. Colt thought about where Nora was right now. He thought about what Dale Weston's next logical move looked like once he understood that documents were being gathered and outside attention was turning toward Millhaven. He was still thinking about it when Rex knocked on the truck window and Colt rolled it down. Hargrove just called me, Rex said. He has an FBI contact in Nashville. Agent Sandra Holt organized crime and civil rights violations. Hargrove has been feeding her information about county services interference networks in Middle Tennessee for the past 14 months. She already has a file on Dale Weston. Colt looked at him. She wants to speak to you directly, Rex said. Tonight. Colt was quiet for a moment. Set it up, he said. The call came through at 9:17 that evening. Holt's voice was the voice of a woman who had been running on organized purpose for long enough that it had become her natural register, the voice of someone accustomed to being the most prepared person in any conversation, and was now dealing with a variable she had not fully accounted for. Mr. Briggs, she said, I know why you are in Millhaven. Then you know what I know, Colt said. I know what Hargrove gave you, which is partial. Let me give you the rest. She did not wait for permission. Boyd Weston has been cooperating with our investigation for 6 weeks. He gave us Dale Weston. Dale has given us a network of interference spanning 4 county child services departments and 2 sheriff's offices across Middle Tennessee. We are 11 days from executing simultaneous warrants that will dismantle the entire structure. She paused. If Dale Weston is spooked before those warrants execute, if he understands that the exposure is coming from a direction he can trace, he destroys documentation, and the network goes dark. We lose 12 active cases, 12 children. Mr. Briggs, not one. Colt was quiet. I understand what you saw in that diner, Holt said. She showed her teacher bruised ribs 6 weeks ago, Colt said. The same week Boyd started cooperating with you. He let that sit for a moment. You gave Boyd 11 more days with Nora. The silence from the phone was different from the previous silences. The arrangement, Holt started. What is the arrangement? Another pause. The specific length of a pause that precedes the disclosure of something that sounds considerably worse said aloud than it appeared on paper. Boyd Weston agreed to continued cohabitation with the child during the cooperation period to avoid alerting Dale. In exchange, a social worker is conducting welfare checks. Conducting welfare checks, Colt said. On a child whose legal guardian is the man you made the deal with, who controls what the social worker sees, who controls what gets reported. His voice had gone very quiet. You made a deal that left a 7-year-old girl as collateral. We made a deal that was supposed to last 3 weeks, Holt said. The documentation took longer than projected. It always takes longer, Colt said, and she is always still in that house. Hatch was standing outside the truck, arms folded present, without being theatrical about it. The specific presence of a man close enough to intervene if needed. Rex was 10 feet further back watching both of them. What do you need, Holt said. The question surprised him, the directness of it, the admission that the calculation had shifted. I need Nora out of that house tonight, Colt said. Not tomorrow, not at sunrise. Tonight, you have Boyd cooperating. Boyd can make that happen without alerting Dale. You figure out how. He paused. And I need your word that the 11 days hold, that the warrants execute, that the network comes down the way you described. If I do that, Holt said, your people stand down. My people arrive and they stand witness. In full public view, nobody touches anything, nobody obstructs anything. We are civilians exercising our legal right to be present in a public town. He paused. And every phone camera in that group will be pointed at every official action that happens in Millhaven over the next 72 hours, which is the only guarantee any of us have that your 11 days actually produces what you said it will. You don't trust me? Holt said. I'm managing risk, Colt said. Same as you. The line was quiet for a long moment. He could hear faintly in the background the ambient sound of a command post, other voices, something in motion. Give me 2 hours, Holt said. You have one, Colt said. After that, I call off nothing. He hung up. The evening air outside the truck was thick with humidity, and the sound of the creek in the distant low note of traffic on Route 64. Rex walked over and stood beside Hatch. 47 confirmed riders, Rex said. More coming through the night. Nobody moves until I say, Colt said. Nobody. Rex nodded. Hatch said, Slade. Colt looked at him. If Dale Weston has been feeding through Slade, Hatch said, then Dale already knows the rough shape of what we have. He knows you're not leaving. He knows documentation is being gathered. He's going to move before we do. Yes, Colt said. So the question is what his move looks like. Colt had been thinking about that for 2 hours. Dale Weston was not a man who operated through direct confrontation. He operated through systems, through phone calls made to the right people, through files that got quietly rerouted to the right desks. But systems required time and required the infrastructure to remain intact. If Dale understood the infrastructure was being examined from outside, if he understood that federal attention was turning toward Millhaven, his first move would not be to run. His first move would be to close the most exposed point, to make sure that the thing most likely to confirm everything was no longer available to confirm it. Boyd was cooperating with the FBI. If Dale figured that out, Boyd was the exposed point, and Nora was with Boyd. Colt's phone rang. He looked at the screen. Holt. He answered. Her voice was different this time, still controlled, but something underneath the control had changed, a frequency of contained alarm that had not been present before. Mr. Briggs, she said, we have a problem. Dale Weston left his residence 38 minutes ago. His vehicle is showing movement toward Millhaven. Colt felt something cold move through his chest. Direction, he said. Toward Main Street, Holt said. We have a surveillance unit 4 minutes out, but if Dale reaches Boyd before we can intercept, the situation changes. She stopped. Recalculated, Nora Colt said. A pause of 2 seconds that felt like something structural giving way. Boyd took her to the shop after school today, Holt said. She is in the back office of Weston Auto. Colt was already moving. He hit the truck door, yanked it open, got the engine running. Phone still in his hand. He looked at the screen. 31 unread messages from numbers he recognized. Riders checking in, staging, asking for the word. He typed 4 words and sent them to every number in the chain simultaneously. Millhaven. Now, all of you. He floored the accelerator, and the truck's tires bit into the asphalt of the motel lot, and he came out onto the street and pushed it hard toward the east end of town. Behind him in the side mirror, Hatch's Road King came out of the lot. Then Rex's truck. Then from the county highway 2 miles out where the riders had been staging through the afternoon and evening, headlights began to appear. More had arrived through the night than the afternoon count reflected, the chain having delivered its full weight. Individual arrivals stacking into collective movement. The sound reached him a half-second after the sight. The first low thunder of it, distant and building. The harmonic of many large engines finding their collective register, a sound that had no equivalent in ordinary life, and that Colt felt in his sternum, the way you feel certain kinds of music before you hear it with your ears. He pressed the accelerator, and the county highway unrolled ahead of him in the headlights, and he breathed through his nose and ran the route in his head. 2 miles to the edge of town, 6 blocks down Main, east on Calder to the strip of shops. Weston Auto, third bay from the end, floodlight over the door, back office where a 7-year-old girl had been left, while the men in her life conducted the business of her destruction. His phone was on the seat beside him, screen up, Holt's last message still showing. He had made his own decision about what came next. The decision was already behind him, along with the gravel and the dark and everything that had seemed like a choice before it stopped being one. The conversation with Holt stayed with him through the rest of the evening and into the time he spent sitting in the truck watching the staging riders check in through his phone screen. He had dealt with federal law enforcement before. He had sat across tables from agents who had files on him that were thicker than some novels, who had watched him with the particular flat attention of people who had learned that patience was their primary tool and that most situations resolved themselves if you waited long enough. He had learned in those rooms that federal agents operated on timelines that bore no relationship to the timelines of the people their cases were built around. A 3-year investigation was an ordinary thing from the inside of a federal office. From the inside of a 7-year-old's life, 3 years was something else entirely. He did not resent Holt. He understood her position with the clarity of someone who had spent enough time on the other side of institutional thinking to know how it worked. You built a case that would hold. You did not move until the case would hold. You weighed the ongoing harm against the long-term outcome, and you told yourself the math worked. The math worked until you sat in a diner booth across from the ongoing harm and watched it fold its hands on the counter and tell you it puts medicine in my food so I sleep. After that, the math worked differently. What stayed with him most from the call was not the 11 days or the deal Boyd had made, or even the revelation about Dale's source inside the task force. What stayed with him was the moment Holt had said, "What do you need?" The directness of it, the way she had moved without theater and without apparent difficulty from defending her position to abandoning it. Not because Colt had made a compelling legal argument or presented evidence that changed the calculus. Because he had said, "You made a deal that left a 7-year-old girl as collateral," and the silence that followed had been the specific silence of a person recognizing that something true had been said. That kind of recognition required a certain kind of person. It required someone who had not yet made the calculation that being right mattered more than being honest about when you were wrong. He respected it even though it did not resolve anything. He was still thinking about it when his phone buzzed with a message from a Cookville number he did not recognize, and he opened it and read, "You should leave Millhaven tonight," and felt the specific sensation of a situation that he thought he understood, developing an additional dimension he had not accounted for. 40 seconds after Rex's call, 40 seconds was nothing. 40 seconds was the time it took to read a message and type a response and hit send. It was not the time required for information to travel through a chain from Rex to some observer and back. It was the time required for someone who had already been watching to respond to what they were watching. He had sat in the truck and worked through it with the particular methodical patience that difficult situations required. He had listed what he knew and listed what he did not know, and listed what the overlap between those two lists suggested, and at the end of the exercise, he had a provisional conclusion that he knew might be wrong and that he was going to act on anyway because provisional was what was available, and available was what you worked with. The chain had a weak point. The weak point had been there for 11 years, and the man who had built the architecture of protection around Boyd Weston and managed the filed reports and redirected the clipboard women and kept a 7-year-old girl in the wrong house for years longer than she should have been, there had known about the weak point and had been using it. That meant Dale Weston had not been reactive. He had been prepared. A prepared man was more dangerous than a reactive one in every way except one. A prepared man had already decided what he was going to do, which meant his range of available responses was narrower than it looked. He would do the thing he had prepared to do. He would not improvise because improvisation required accepting that the situation was outside his control, and accepting that was not something Dale Weston appeared capable of. Colt had thought about what a prepared man with a narrowing set of options did when he understood that the options were narrowing. He had thought about Boyd. He had thought about Nora. He had been thinking about both of them when Holt called back and told him about the gray sedan moving toward Millhaven. Miriam Cross had been teaching 4th grade for 12 years, and in those 12 years, she had filed 7 reports with County Child Protective Services. Of the 7, 3 had resulted in removals. 2 of those removals had been reversed on appeal. Within 6 months, the children returned to the homes they had been removed from. The reversals driven not by evidence of improvement, but by the particular bureaucratic pressure that came when a family had a good attorney and a sympathetic judge, and the ability to make the process more expensive than the county wanted to sustain. She had tracked both children after the reversals. She had made it her business in the unofficial way that teachers sometimes made things their business when the official channels had demonstrated their limits. One of the children had aged out of the system at 18 and was currently working at a grocery distribution center in Nashville. The other had been removed a second time 2 years after the reversal, this time permanently, and was now in a stable placement with a family in Cookville who had been fostering for 11 years and who Miriam had spoken with twice on the phone, both times finding them to be exactly what they presented as. She kept track because it mattered that someone kept track, because children did not cease to exist when they moved out of her classroom, and because the system that was supposed to follow them was the same system that had already demonstrated in her specific experience a variable and sometimes inadequate commitment to doing so. Nora Hayes had been in her classroom for 7 months. In those 7 months, Miriam had documented 14 specific observations that she had considered significant enough to record, from small things like the way Nora always ate everything on her lunch tray, including items she had previously expressed not liking to, larger things like the Wednesday 6 weeks ago when Nora had arrived wearing long sleeves in August and had shown her what was under them. She had kept the documentation in a folder on her home computer rather than in the school system. She had done this because the school system's records were accessible to the principal, and the principal had a relationship with Boyd Weston that she did not fully understand, but that she had observed was warmer than professional courtesy alone required. The principal had attended Boyd's daughter's christening 3 years ago before Nora's mother had left, back when Boyd Weston was a man with a family rather than a man with a stepdaughter and a history of clipboard visits. She had not known what she was going to do with the folder. She had known that she was going to have it ready when she figured out what she was going to do with it. When Hargrove had called, she had understood immediately that this was the moment the folder was for. She had printed everything that afternoon, organized it, chronologically put it in an envelope, and driven to the faculty parking lot and unlocked her car and waited. She had not known exactly what she was waiting for. She had known she was waiting for someone who was actually going to do something with what she had. Colt Briggs had gotten out of the truck and walked across the asphalt, and she had said his name, and she had known from the way he received it without surprise, just the simple acceptance of a man accustomed to being known in rooms he entered, that this was the someone she had been waiting for. She had given him the envelope. She had watched him take it and turn it over once in his hands and put it inside his vest. And she had understood, watching him walk back to the truck, that the folder was no longer just documentation. It was now part of something larger, something that had its own momentum, something that was going to move regardless of what any individual person decided to do or not do. She had driven home and made dinner and called her sister in Memphis and talked for 40 minutes about things that had nothing to do with Millhaven or Nora Hayes or Dale Weston or folders on home computers. Then she had gone to bed and lain awake for 3 hours listening to the August rain and thinking about a 7-year-old girl in an apartment behind a mechanic's shop on the east side of town. She had gotten up at 11:30 and driven to Calder Street. She had parked 2 blocks away and walked the rest. She had stood on the sidewalk across from Weston Auto and watched the federal agents move through the shop with their vests and their protocol and their organized purpose. And she had watched 63 people in leather stand in complete silence on both sides of the street. And she had watched Dale Weston be walked out in handcuffs, and she had felt something that did not have a clean name. Something that was part relief and part exhaustion, and part the specific emotion that comes when something you have been carrying alone for a long time is finally being carried by enough people that you can feel the weight redistribute. She had stood on the sidewalk for a long time. Then she had driven home and slept for the first time in weeks without waking at 3 in the morning. Calder Street was a 2-lane road that ran east off Main through the commercial strip on the edge of Millhaven, and at 9:40 on a Tuesday night in August, it was empty, in the way that small town streets go empty after dark, not abandoned, but resting the storefronts closed, and the parking lots thinning, and the overhead lights doing their patient work on pavement that had nobody to illuminate. Colt came in from the east side, which put him 2 blocks from Weston Auto, before he hit the main strip, and as he turned onto Calder, the floodlight over the third bay was visible immediately, a hard white cone of light over a rolled-down bay door. The lot in front was dark except for 2 vehicles. Boyd Weston's truck and a gray sedan parked at an angle that suggested someone had stopped quickly rather than parked deliberately. Dale was already there. Colt stopped the truck half a block short and got out without killing the engine and moved toward the shop on foot, staying out of the floodlight's reach, keeping to the shadow of the building line. The shop was quiet from the outside. No voices audible through the walls. No movement visible through the gap at the bottom of the rolled bay door. The side entrance, a plain metal door set into the wall adjacent to the first bay, was standing 3 inches open. Not forced, not broken, left that way deliberately. He went through it. The interior smelled of motor oil and metal shavings, and something chemical beneath both and underneath. Everything else, the faint smell of coffee from a drip machine on a shelf near the partition wall, its orange element light still burning a half-full pot sitting warm. The main bay was dark except for the ambient glow leaking under the roll door and a single work light on an extension cord hanging over a car with its hood propped and its engine exposed. Tools arranged on a wheeled cart beside it with the particular order of a man who was meticulous about his workspace and perhaps nothing else. The office was at the back, separated from the bay by a half wall with a window in it and a door that stood partly open, light coming through the gap. The flat institutional light of a fluorescent tube in a room built to be functional rather than inhabited. Colt crossed the bay floor in the dark, placing his feet carefully, his boots finding the concrete with deliberate quiet. He reached the half wall and stopped. Through the window he could see the office. Boyd Weston was standing with his back against the far wall, arms slightly out from his sides, the specific posture of a man who had been told to be still and was complying because the alternative was worse. His face was doing several things simultaneously, fear and calculation, and beneath both of them a particular resignation that Colt recognized as the expression of a man watching the careful construction of his own life come apart in real time. Dale Weston stood in the center of the room. He was in his late 60s, heavy in the way of a man who had been physically strong decades ago and still carried the architecture of it beneath the added weight of years. White hair cropped short, face deeply creased in the way of men who had spent lifetimes either outdoors or under pressure or both. He held a phone in one hand loosely, and he was speaking in a voice too low for Colt to hear through the window glass. Nora was in the corner. She was sitting on the floor behind the desk in the corner that was farthest from both men and farthest from the door. The corner a child finds when she has learned that corners are the only defensive position reliably available to her. Knees drawn up, arms wrapped around them, the oversized hoodie pulled tight, hood up. Her face was turned toward the wall at an angle that suggested she had made a decision some time ago to make herself as small and as invisible as possible. Her shoulders were moving with her breathing. She was awake. Colt pushed the office door open with his left hand and walked in. Both men turned. Dale Weston's face did something complex and involuntary. Surprise arrived first, genuine and unguarded, the reflexive, uncontrolled reaction of a man who had not expected this specific variable. Then came the rapid suppression of surprise into authority, the automatic reassertion of the expression he had worn as his default for 30 years. The expression of a man who was accustomed to being the most powerful person in every room he entered, and was reclaiming that position before anyone else could notice it had been lost for 2 seconds. Boyd made a sound that did not resolve into a word. Dale looked at Colt with the flat, assessing eyes of a man running a calculation. "Who are you?" Dale said. "Colt Briggs, Black Iron MC." He said it the way Miriam Cross had said his name in the faculty parking lot. Not as introduction, as information being placed on a table. Dale's jaw tightened once. He knew the name. Whatever network of information he had been running through Ray Slade and whatever other connections existed in the chain, it had included this. The single tightening of his jaw was the tell of a man absorbing confirmation of something he had hoped not to have confirmed. "You need to leave," Dale said. "You have no idea what you are walking into." "I know exactly what I am walking into," Colt said. He said it without heat, the way you state a fact. Federal task force out of Nashville. 12 open cases. 3 years of work. He looked at Dale steadily. "I also know you have a source inside that task force, which means you did not come here tonight to protect yourself from the outside. You came to close the most exposed point before the outside could reach it, which means Boyd was not leaving this building the same as he came in." Boyd made the sound again. "This time it resolved," Gerald Boyd said. It was what men said when they used a name they had said 10,000 times across a lifetime, and were now using it in a register that none of those previous times had required. "Shut up," Dale said. He had not looked away from Colt. His phone was still in his hand, held loosely at his side. "You are a man with a felony record who has walked into a private business after hours. Whatever you think you know, whatever people have told you, you are standing in a room where none of it matters." Colt did not respond to that. He looked past Dale. He looked at the corner behind the desk. "Nora," he said, not loudly. Just her name said in the way you say a name when you want someone to know you are there and you are not leaving. The hoodie moved. Pale blue eyes came up over the top of drawn-up knees and found him across the office. And in those eyes, Colt saw the specific quality of recognition that he had been carrying with him since the diner. Not surprise, not the fragile upward lurch of hope, but something more fundamental. The recognition of someone who had held a single fact in the dark for a long time and was now seeing that fact confirmed in the physical world. He came back. "Come here," Colt said. Dale stepped to his left, moving between Colt and the corner, with the measured, unhurried movement of a man who understood leverage and was repositioning to maintain it. Not panic, tactics. The movement of a man who had spent 30 years turning situations to his advantage and was doing it now by reflex. "She stays where she is," Dale said. Colt looked at him. "You are one man," Dale said, "and you are going to walk back out through that door and get in your vehicle and leave Millhaven tonight." He said it with the particular confidence of a man who had said variations of this sentence his entire life and had watched it work every time. The confidence of someone for whom power had never failed to function. Then the sound arrived. It came through the floor first. A low frequency that was felt before it was heard, a vibration that came up through the concrete and into the soles of Colt's boots and into his knees and into the base of his sternum. The sound of many large engines close and getting closer. Then it resolved into something more than vibration and became actual sound, and the sound grew with a speed and totality that seemed to alter the pressure in the building itself, that made the tools on the cart outside vibrate against each other with faint metallic ringing, that made the fluorescent tube above them flicker once, as if the building was registering what was happening outside its walls. Through the narrow gap at the bottom of the rolled bay door, a line of headlights swept across the concrete floor. Then more. Then more after that, until they were no longer individual headlights, but a continuous wash of light that moved and breathed with the movement of engines settling into position. 63 motorcycles on Calder Street. Not a sound that built to a peak and then fell. A sound that arrived at a certain register and then simply was a permanent feature of that specific Tuesday night in August in Millhaven, Tennessee, the way certain weather becomes the whole sky and stays there. Dale Weston turned toward the roll door. He turned back to Colt. Something in his face for the first time since Colt had walked through the office door had lost its architecture. The authority from position expression, the one his son wore at the sheriff's department, the one Colt had learned to read in men who derived their sense of safety entirely from the structures around them, rather than from anything inside themselves, came apart. Not all at once, in the way of things that have been holding for a long time under accumulated pressure, from the edges inward. The specific, visible process of a man discovering that the room he has spent 30 years constructing around himself has walls that someone else can reach through. How many? Dale said. His voice had changed, still controlled. But the thing underneath the control had shifted in a way that could not be put back. Enough, Colt said. Not a threat, not a number. A fact. More than you planned for. More than the system you built was designed to handle. More than 3 decades of managed silence and redirected reports and county lanyards and church handshakes had ever prepared him for. Outside, a Harley came to rest close enough that its engine vibration was tactile through the exterior wall. Then another, then others, until the individual arrivals became indistinguishable from the collective presence. And Weston Auto seemed to hum from the outside, and the building itself made into a kind of instrument by what surrounded it. Then Boyd Weston moved, not toward the door, not toward Colt. He took one step forward and to the left and placed himself between Dale and the corner where Nora was sitting. It was not a large step. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was a single step made by a man who had spent 6 weeks cooperating with a federal investigation and giving up his uncle's network piece by piece, and who had told himself, in the way people tell themselves necessary things, that he was doing it for reasons that were good enough, and who was now in this specific moment in this specific room, watching a 7-year-old girl sit in a corner behind a desk, while the man who had made all of this possible stood 3 feet away and was finding that the reasons he had told himself were not quite the shape he had believed them to be. Dale, Boyd said. His voice had nothing performed in it, no calculation, no practiced warmth. Stop. Dale looked at him. The 2 men looked at each other across 30 years of family, and the specific weight of what Boyd had done over the past 6 weeks, and the specific weight of what Dale had driven across 3 counties tonight to do, and neither of them spoke for a moment. Colt did not move. He did not look away from the corner. He let the moment be what it was. Boyd had not done this for noble reasons. Boyd had not done any of what he had done for noble reasons. But he was doing this now, and Colt understood the difference between a man who did the right thing for imperfect reasons and a man who did the wrong thing for every reason available. And he understood that in rooms like this one, at moments like this one, the distinction mattered less than the action itself. Dale's jaw worked. He looked at Boyd. He looked at Colt. He looked toward the roll door behind which 63 engines were running their patient collective note. And the posture went out of him, not dramatically. It did not collapse. It simply ceased to be held the way a breath ceases to be held, with the particular quiet of something that has been maintained by effort for a very long time and is now allowed to stop. Colt looked at the corner. Nora, he said, come here. The word came out the way it had come out in the diner, naturally, without calculation. Just a direction given gently to a small person who needed a direction. Nora unfolded from the corner. She did it with the careful, self-managed effort he had watched in the diner. The effort of a child who had learned to move without asking for help, because asking introduced variables she could not control. She stood up behind the desk. She looked at Dale without expression, the practiced look of a child who had developed an entire repertoire of ways to not draw attention. And then she moved around the desk and skirted Dale's position without coming within reach of him. The trajectory so practiced and so efficient that it had clearly been calculated many times before in many different configurations of the same room. She reached Colt and stopped beside him. He felt her hand find the side of his leg. Not grabbing, not clinging, just touching, lightly confirming. A single point of contact made not from need but from the specific kind of knowledge that certain solid things can be relied upon to stay where they are. He put his hand on her shoulder, lightly, present. Boyd Weston was looking at Nora with an expression that Colt did not immediately have a name for and spent a long moment examining. Not the expression of a predator watching something escape, not the expression of a man calculating his next position. Something more wretched and more honest than either of those. The expression of a man looking at the sum of a series of choices and finding in the specific terrible clarity of this particular moment that the sum was not what he had intended when he made the individual choices that produced it. It was a deeply inadequate expression for what it represented. Colt filed that fact separately from the expression itself. The side door of the shop opened, and Hatch Carver came through it. He took in the room in one complete sweep that positions the faces the phone in Dale's hand. He positioned himself at the door without being asked or directed, with the quiet efficiency of a man who had done this long enough to know where to stand before being told. 30 seconds later, red and blue lights strobed through the gap at the bottom of the roll door, mixing with the motorcycle headlights and the floodlight outside into a wash of fractured color that moved across the ceiling of the bay like something restless and unresolved. Car doors, voices, multiple controlled official. The measured authority of people arriving with paperwork and protocol, and the particular energy of a federal timeline that had just been forced to move faster than it wanted to. Agent Sandra Holt came through the side door wearing a vest with 3 letters on the back that Colt had been waiting to see since the phone call an hour ago. She was in her early 40s, sharp-faced with the bearing of someone who had been moving toward this specific room for 3 years and was now here and had not slowed down in order to arrive. She looked at Colt. She looked at Nora. She looked at Dale. She held Dale for a long moment with the look of someone who had spent 3 years building a file on a man and was now in the same room with him and was taking the measure of whether the file had been adequate. Dale Allen Weston, she said, you are under arrest for obstruction of a federal child welfare investigation, witness tampering, and conspiracy to interfere with child protective services across multiple jurisdictions. She listed the charges because they were the charges and because the specificity of them. Each count a particular action Dale had taken on a particular day for a particular purpose was itself a message. This is not a misunderstanding. This is a documentation of choices you made, and we have been watching you make them. Dale said nothing. He looked at Boyd once more. Boyd did not look back. Federal agents moved through Weston Auto with the practiced efficiency of people executing a plan that had been revised at speed but not abandoned. A woman Colt did not recognize spoke to Boyd in a low voice near the wall. Boyd sat on the wheeled stool from the mechanic's bay and put his hands on his knees and said nothing. A paramedic arrived and offered to look at Nora, and Nora looked at Colt first before she agreed. He nodded once. She turned back to the paramedic and let herself be looked at. Colt went out through the side door and stood in the night air outside the shop and breathed. Calder Street had assembled itself around Weston Auto in the time it had taken for the inside of the shop to resolve. 63 motorcycles lined both sides of the street, riders standing at their machines with their engines off leather and denim, and the silver hardware of different cuts catching the red and blue strobe of the federal vehicles in irregular scattered light. Not a wall of aggression, not a demonstration of force in the way that force is usually demonstrated, something that required a different word. The word for what happens when 63 people who have individually spent years being the ones that systems look past or look through stand together in disciplined silence as an act of witness, as an act that says we are here and we see this and we are not going anywhere. Millhaven had come out to watch, not in the way of crowds that come for spectacle, in the way of a town that had been collectively pretending not to know something for a long time and was now being asked by the simple, undeniable weight of what was in front of it to stop pretending. Porch lights on up and down the street, faces in windows. A few people on the sidewalk with their arms crossed saying nothing. Connie Pruitt was there. Colt saw her from the shop doorway standing on the sidewalk 200 feet away, in the clothes she had been wearing at the diner that evening, as if she had walked here directly without going home first. She was watching the federal agents move in and out of the shop, and her face had the expression of a woman who had called a county line 8 months ago and gotten nothing, who had asked, what am I supposed to do, in the genuinely exhausted way of someone out of options, and who was now watching what happened when nothing was called out for what it was by enough people at once. Dale Weston was walked out of the shop at 11:17. He walked with his spine straight and his chin level and his face holding on to the last available remnant of the posture he had maintained for 30 years. The posture of a man who belonged, who had standing, who was owed deference by the town around him, simply by virtue of having been here long enough and having built enough of the architecture that everyone else moved through. He walked through the line of engines and leather and faces that the town had been taught for 3 decades to treat as the problem, and he did not look at any of them. But Colt watched him slow involuntarily by a single step when the weight of the silence reached him. Not the silence of absence, The silence of presence, of 63 people standing in absolute stillness, not performing anything, not making a point with theater or noise, simply being there, simply refusing to be anywhere else. While the man who had spent 30 years ensuring that their kind of people were managed and dismissed and looked at him was walked to a federal vehicle in handcuffs. Dale got into the car. The door closed. The car pulled away. Colt stood in the doorway of the shop and breathed. Hatch appeared beside him. He had a cup of coffee in each hand, had apparently located the drip machine in the office, and decided that the situation, whatever its specifics, called for coffee, which was Hatch's resolution to most situations that could not be resolved by other available means. He held one out. Colt took it and drank. It was burnt from sitting too long on the element, and it was the best thing he had tasted in 18 hours. They stood together in the doorway and did not say anything for a while. Rex, Colt said finally. Parked on Main, Hatch said. He'll keep the chain coordinated until Holt's people are done. Nobody moves without your word. Colt nodded. Ray Slade, Hatch said. What did he do? Wrote out around 10, Hatch said. Left a message with the Cookville chapter for you. Said he was sorry. Said he knew that wasn't enough. Hatch looked at the street. He's right on both counts. Colt drank his coffee. He thought about Ray Slade on a dark highway somewhere between Millhaven and Cookville carrying a sorry, that was true, and that did not cover what it needed to cover, and he thought about what came after that kind of sorry. Not forgiveness as a sudden event, as a long, slow process of demonstrated change that might or might not arrive depending on what a man actually did with the time he had left. He thought about the work that would take and the fact that the work was real and that there were no clean endings in situations like this, only the next choice and the one after that. He filed it. Not tonight. Inside the shop, the paramedic was working with the patient. Unhurried gentleness of someone who knew how to be near a frightened child without making the fear worse. Nora sat on a low toolbox near the wall, hands in her lap, pale blue eyes tracking the paramedic's movements with the attentiveness she turned on everything. She looked from this distance extraordinarily small inside the oversized hoodie. She also looked for the first time since Colt had seen her, like something had released a fraction of its grip on her shoulders. Not completely, not permanently, but by some small, measurable degree that was visible in the way she held herself. The specific quality of a room where the thing you have been waiting for has finally arrived and turned out to be what it said it was. Holt came and stood beside Colt in the doorway. Boyd Weston, she said. He's cooperating, Colt said. Has been for 6 weeks. That cooperation is what built the case that's going to roll up 12 individuals across 4 counties, Holt said. Colt looked at her. It also put her in that corner for 6 weeks after her collarbone was already bruised. Holt was quiet for a moment. The organized purpose in her expression had a different quality now. Still there, still the fuel that ran her, but banked lower, the kind of controlled burn that came after the main event, when there was still work to do, but the most acute pressure had passed. We made a bad call, she said. The sentence had the quality of something that cost something to say. Holt was not a woman who said sentences like that easily or often. The timeline extension, she said. We told ourselves it was manageable. We told ourselves it was 11 days. She looked toward Nora on the toolbox inside the shop. We managed her like a piece of a case. Yes, Colt said. I'm sorry, she said. He looked at her for a moment and accepted the apology without ceremony, because ceremonies were for situations that were simpler than this one. What happens to her now, he asked. Emergency placement tonight, Holt said. We have a family identified in the system for temporary housing, and we can have the paperwork processed by morning. Ruth Calloway, Colt said. She lives on Nora's street. She has called the county line twice for this girl. She is a known adult in Nora's life, a trusted one. And whatever the placement process requires tonight, I need it to happen there and not somewhere Nora has never been. Holt looked at him. That is not standard procedure, she said. I know what standard procedure got her, Colt said. Make the call. A pause. Then Holt reached for her phone and moved back into the shop. At 2 in the morning, the Calder Street was almost empty. The federal vehicles remained. 3 motorcycles whose riders had stayed without being asked. Hatch and 2 men from the Alabama chapter who had ridden 8 hours to stand on a street in Millhaven and would ride 8 hours back before sunrise without expecting to be thanked for either trip. The paramedics' vehicle still present because Holt had asked them to stay until Nora's placement was confirmed and the paperwork was signed. Colt was sitting on the hood of his truck in the dark coffee, long gone cold in the cup beside him, watching the last of it. He heard small footsteps on the asphalt before he saw her. Nora came out through the shop's side door with the paramedic and stopped on the sidewalk and looked around the street. She was looking for something. Her eyes moving over the vehicles and the remaining riders, and the federal agent still working inside, looking with the systematic patience he had first seen in the diner when she had watched him from booth 9 before deciding to climb off the seat and walk across the floor to sit beside him. Then she found him on the hood of the truck, and the looking stopped. She crossed the street. She stopped at the bumper of the truck and looked up at him. "Where are they all going?" she said. "Home," Colt said. "Most of them." She looked down Calder at the last of the departing headlights. Then she looked back at him. "Did they come because of me?" He looked at her. The honest answer and the easy answer were the same answer, which did not happen often enough in his experience. "Yeah," he said. She processed this with the interior quality he had been watching then all evening, turning information over carefully, assigning it a place, comparing it against what she already knew. Then she said, "You called them." "Yes, all of them. Not all of them directly. Some of them called other people. That is how it works." She thought about that. Why do they listen to you? The question was the kind children asked. Not rhetorical, not performed. Genuinely asking the thing they wanted to know without the social cushioning that adults use to soften honest questions. Colt thought about it honestly. He thought about Holman Correctional and 2 years and the additional 6 months that he did not discuss with anyone. He thought about Aaron, about the gas station parking lot outside Knoxville, about 17 years of carrying a name that he could not say out loud without feeling what was behind it. He thought about the specific feeling of being the thing that stood between a problem and the person the problem was aimed at, and what it had cost him historically to be that thing, and why he had kept doing it anyway. "Because they trust me to know when something matters enough," he said. "And because I don't call unless it does." Nora looked at him for a moment. "It mattered," she said. "Yes," he said. She climbed up onto the hood of the truck beside him without asking. The same easy self-management she had used on the diner stool, the same careful arrangement of herself in the available space. She sat with her legs hanging over the bumper and her hands in her lap and looked at the street. She did not lean into him. She did not perform comfort or seek it openly. She sat beside him the way she had sat beside him at the counter, with the particular quality of a child who had learned that proximity was safer than contact and was testing the difference between the two. In real time, finding out whether the solid things stayed solid when you got close enough to feel them. Colt sat beside her and looked at the street and let her test it. Hatch pulled his Road King to the curb and cut the engine and leaned on the handlebar, looking at the two of them on the hood of the truck. He had the expression of a man filing something away somewhere it would not get lost. "Ruth Calloway confirmed," he said. "Holt came through. Placement paperwork is being processed tonight." Colt looked at Nora. "You know Mrs. Calloway. She makes sweet tea," Nora said. She paused for a moment, working something out. "She lets me watch television." "You are going to stay with her for a while," Colt said. Nora processed this. "For how long?" "I don't know exactly," Colt said. "But people are going to make sure it is somewhere safe." "And Mrs. Calloway," he stopped. He looked at her directly. "She called the county line twice because she was worried about you." "She tried when it was not easy to try." Nora was quiet for a moment. "Most people don't try," she said. "It was not a complaint. It was an observation delivered in the flat, observational way she delivered most things, the product of a child who had spent several years collecting data about how adults behaved in situations that required something of them, and had arrived at her conclusions through careful, repeated observation." "I know," Colt said. "She did." The paramedic came to the truck and spoke to Nora quietly about the next 2 hours, about going to Mrs. Calloway's house, about what the process looked like. Nothing technical or institutional, just the logistics of the immediate future, explained gently in the dark by someone who understood that children needed the shape of the next thing to feel less like a void they were being lowered into. Nora listened with her hands in her lap and her pale eyes steady and her jaw set in the way Colt had been watching all night. The way that said, "I am listening and I am managing, and I am not going to fall apart because falling apart has never been available to me. And I do not entirely know how to do it even now when it might finally be safe to try one." She got down from the hood of the truck. She stood on the asphalt and looked up at Colt. "Are you going to leave?" The question sat in the night air between them, simple and enormous, carrying inside it every version of that question, every time a child who has learned that adults eventually leave asks it of one who has not left yet. Colt looked at her. He thought about the architecture of honesty, what it could carry and what it could not. The difference between a truth that helped and a truth that simply named a wound without offering anything to put against it. I'm going to ride out, he said. That's what I do. He held her eyes. But I will know where you are. And if you are not okay, if anyone who is supposed to be watching out for you is not watching out for you, you find a way to tell someone you trust. He paused. What you did in that diner was the bravest thing I have seen in a long time. She looked at him. What I did was scared, she said. Yeah, Colt said. That's what brave is. Something moved through her face. Not a smile, not quite, but the precursor to the possibility of one. The expression of a person who has been shown something they have not seen before and is holding it carefully to see whether it will hold its shape over time. She put her hand out, small, serious, extended in the way of someone who had decided that a handshake was the honest version of the gestures that adults usually made. The hug that cost nothing, the casual goodbye that meant something else, the promise delivered with warmth and forgotten by the following week. This was the version that meant what it looked like. This was the version that required something of both parties. Colt took her hand and shook it. Okay, Nora Hayes said. She turned and walked with the paramedic toward the vehicle that would take her to Ruth Calloway's house, on the street where she had lived without ever having been safe. Her pale eyes did not look back, which Colt understood was not coldness. It was its opposite. The specific courage of a child who had learned that looking back too long is a way of keeping yourself in the place you were trying to leave. She had spent long enough in that place. She was not going to spend one more unnecessary second there. He watched the vehicle's taillights until they turned off Calder and disappeared. Ray's diner was open at 6 in the morning. Colt knew because he had been parked in the lot since 5:30 engine off, watching the lights come on inching through the rain-streaked glass. Connie arriving first, moving through the kitchen with the particular efficiency of someone who had done the same sequence of tasks in the same order for 11 years and no longer had to think about any of it. The kitchen lighting up section by section. The closed sign turning to open in the thin early morning gray. The storm had passed sometime after 3, leaving the air washed clean and the parking lot gravel dark with water and the Tennessee sky above Route 64, a pale translucent blue that looked like something that had been remade overnight and had not yet been marked by the day. He went inside at 6:10. Connie looked up from the counter and looked at him for a long moment and then did something she had never done in 11 years of working mornings at Ray's on Route 64. She did not say good morning. She did not ask what he wanted. She turned and walked to booth 9 at the back of the diner and set a mug on the table and turned back toward the kitchen without looking at him again. Booth 9, the last booth in the row, the one with the burned-out light above it that nobody had gotten around to replacing. The dimmest corner in the diner, or in my eyes, the booth where it had started. He sat down. He wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at the scratched surface of the table and the worn wood and the accumulated texture of a place that had been holding the weight of people stopping here for a very long time. And he drank his coffee slowly and let the morning do what mornings do. The diner filled around him the way Ray's filled in the early morning, with the quiet, gradual arrival of people who had somewhere to be and were stopping here first. Early shift workers with their thermoses already in hand, stopping for a hot plate before the long day. A trucker at the counter with a newspaper he was not reading. An older couple who sat at the far end and ordered eggs without consulting the menu. The ease of people who had been coming to the same place long enough that the menu was something they carried inside them rather than on the laminated board. Ordinary morning. The television in the upper corner showed local news on mute captions, running in their slightly delayed way across the bottom of the screen. He watched his own name appear in the text crawl. Biker group, federal investigation, Millhaven arrests. He read it once and looked back at his coffee. Hatch came in at 6:45 and slid into the booth across from him and took the second mug that Connie had apparently anticipated and set across from the first without being asked. They sat. Rex drove out this morning, Hatch said. Said to tell you something, but wouldn't say it to your face because he thought it would make him sound like something he wasn't comfortable sounding like. What is it? Said the last time he felt like something actually worked the way it was supposed to work was a long time ago. Hatch drank his coffee. I'm conveying, not endorsing. Colt almost smiled. It was the closest he had come to it in 2 days, and the almost was real. Tell him I heard him. The morning light was doing something to the diner windows. the early sun catching the rain-streaked glass and breaking it into small, irregular fragments of brightness that moved across the floor, slowly following their own logic, illuminating the warped planking and strips of warm gold that shifted as the light strengthened and the angle changed. Colt watched the light move. He thought about Aaron. Not the way he usually thought about Aaron, which was as a fact that had to be managed, a weight that had to be carried with a certain deliberateness, so it did not tip you in the wrong direction when you were not expecting it. He thought about Aaron the way you think about someone who was real, who had a specific laugh, who had been 17 years old and had existed completely before the world was allowed to take him. Aaron. He let himself hold the name without bracing against it. He let it be what it was, which was a name, which was a person, which was a brother, which was a loss that was real and that had shaped everything that came after it, and that did not need to be managed in this particular moment, because this particular moment was one of the ones where the weight was something he could sit with rather than something he had to actively resist. He sat with it. The morning light moved across booth 9 at its own unhurried pace, indifferent to everything happening in the room, doing only what morning light does in every diner, in every town, along every highway in the country, which is arrive and move and illuminate the ordinary texture of things and eventually become something else, as the day decides what it is going to be. "What's next for you?" Hatch said. Colt wrapped both hands around the mug and looked out the window at Route 64. Outside, a truck went by with its load strapped tight and its lights already off in the morning brightness. And behind it, the highway was empty, and the sky above it was the particular wide-open blue of a day that had not decided yet what it was going to be. "Don't know," Colt said. Hatch looked at him across the table with those pale, almost colorless eyes that had always seen more than they let on. "That's different from before," he said. "Before, not knowing was the point. The not knowing was the whole plan." He held Colt's eyes. "It sounds different now." Colt looked back at his coffee. He thought about the specific difference between running away from a direction and riding toward one. The same motion from the outside, the same highway, the same engine, the same long, flat morning, miles stretching ahead until the road curved out of sight. An entirely different thing from the inside. The inside was what mattered. The inside was what you carried when everything else was the same as it had always been. "Yeah," he said. "Maybe." Connie refilled both mugs without being asked, moving with the particular economy of someone who has been reading tables for 11 years and knows exactly when a mug needs attention without looking directly at it. She set the carafe down and did not move away immediately, and Colt looked up. She was looking at him with the expression of a woman who had something to say that existed outside the normal vocabulary of the transaction between them, outside the order and the refill and the check and the "have a good day." "She's okay," Connie said. "Yeah," Colt said. "She's okay." Connie pressed her lips together, once nodded with the economy of a woman who had spent a lifetime not spending more expression than a moment required, picked up the carafe and went back to the counter without another word. Colt watched her go and understood that the county line call and the 8 months of silence and the clipboard visits that ended with nothing and the genuine exhausted wretchedness of "what am I supposed to do?" had just been in some small and insufficient and very human way answered. Not absolved. Not erased. The 8 months were still the 8 months, and the 3 filed reports were still the 3 filed reports, and the bruised ribs were still the bruised ribs, and all of it was going to have to be carried by someone for a long time. But answered. The diner hummed with its own life. Low music from somewhere in the kitchen. The clink of dishes being stacked. The murmur of the couple at the counter conducting the quiet, low-stakes conversation of people who have been talking to each other across breakfast tables for decades and have reached the comfortable level where silence between sentences is as easy as the sentences themselves. The television captions rolling in their silent loop. The world outside moving on Route 64 in both directions at once, as it always had and always would, carrying people toward the things they needed and away from the things they were leaving, and through the long middle distances between the two where most of living actually happened. At 7:15, Colt put his last 20 on the table under his mug and pulled on his gloves. Outside, his Harley sat in the lot in the early morning light, dark metal absorbing the sun engine, cold and patient. He stood beside it for a moment, with his hand on the grip, and looked at Route 64 in both directions. East. The sun was there. The road was there. The long, flat stretch of Tennessee morning, with its particular quality of light, before the day had decided anything, before the heat had built, and the traffic had found its rhythm, and the ordinary weight of an ordinary day had settled into place. Hatch came out behind him and fired up the Road King, and the engine found its register in the morning air. Not loud in the parking lot, just present the sound of something alive and pointed at whatever came next and willing to go there. Colt swung on. The engine turned over on the first kick. He felt the vibration move up through the frame and into his hands and settle into his chest in the way it always settled. Something that lived close enough to comfort that the distinction between the two stopped mattering somewhere around the third mile. He had learned that over many years and many miles that the road had its own way of resolving certain things that did not resolve any other way, and that you did not have to understand it for it to work. He pulled onto Road 64 heading east. Behind him, the sign above Ray's Diner caught the morning sun at an angle that made the old paint briefly legible through the rust in the years, in the accumulated weight of every person who had ever pulled off the highway because the road had gotten too long and the dark had gotten too heavy, and this was the next lit window. Ray's Diner. Opened 24 hours, established 1974. It had always had a name, Colt Road East. The road opened ahead of him long and flat in early morning empty, and the Tennessee sky above it was the kind of blue that did not ask anything of you. That simply was. Enormous and clear and indifferent and present, the same sky over every county courthouse and every sheriff's substation and every back office of every mechanic's shop where a child had ever sat in a corner with her knees drawn up and her hood pulled tight and her hands folded in the way she had learned to keep them still, waiting for something to change. He rode toward it. He did not look back. Not because there was nothing behind him worth carrying, but because the things that had actually changed you did not need to be looked at to stay with you. They were already inside, already part of the engine, already riding. The morning after was its own specific thing. Colt had experienced enough of them to know that the morning after a situation like the one in the auto shop had a particular quality that distinguished it from ordinary mornings. The body had been running on something elevated for hours, and the morning after was the body returning to its baseline, which felt like a kind of deflation, but was actually just ordinary. Ordinary was what the body was designed for. The elevated thing was the exception. He sat in booth 9 and let ordinary happen around him. The older couple at the counter were talking about whether the rain had done anything for the garden, or whether the soil was still too compacted to let it through properly. The trucker had folded his newspaper and was working through a plate of eggs with the systematic focus of a man fueling up for the road. The television showed a local anchor delivering the morning's news in the mute pantomime of bad news delivered with professional composure. Colt watched the morning happen and drank his coffee and let his mind go where it wanted to go, rather than directing it, which was a thing he rarely allowed himself and which produced, when he did allow it, results that were sometimes useful and sometimes only a catalog of things he had not resolved. This morning it went to Aaron, not the event of Aaron, not the gas station parking lot, not the phone call, but Aaron himself. Aaron at 14, going through a phase of intense interest in model rockets that had lasted approximately 6 weeks before giving way to an equally intense interest in chess, which had also lasted approximately 6 weeks. Aaron at 16, borrowing Colt's truck to take a girl named Stephanie to a movie and bringing it back with the passenger seat adjusted in a way that suggested Stephanie was considerably taller than Aaron had let on. Aaron at 17, sitting at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning, working through a crossword puzzle with the newspaper spread flat and a cup of coffee at his elbow, looking for the first time in Colt's memory like an adult rather than a person in the process of becoming one. That Sunday had been 2 weeks before. Colt had not known it was a document. You never knew which Sunday was a document until afterward, until you were sitting somewhere else, entirely trying to remember the last time things had been ordinary, and the last ordinary thing you could locate was a Sunday morning crossword puzzle and a cup of coffee. He had thought about that Sunday many times across 17 years. He thought about it now in booth 9 with the morning light moving across the floor, and Hatch across from him, not saying anything because Hatch understood when not saying anything was the right thing. Aaron would have been 34 years old now. Colt tried occasionally to imagine what 34-year-old Aaron would have looked like, what he would have been doing, whether the rockets and the chess and the crossword puzzles would have resolved into something, or whether he would have remained the kind of person who moved through interest with deep temporary intensity, which was its own valid way of being in the world. He could not get the image to hold. 17 years was too long and the material available was too sparse, and the imagination kept sliding back to the Sunday morning crossword and stopping there because that was where the reliable material ended. He had come to understand over time that this was not a failure of imagination. It was the accurate shape of loss. The loss of the possible rather than the actual. The loss of all the Sundays that were supposed to come after the last Sunday and did not. He sat with it this morning without bracing against it. That was different. He noticed that it was different and did not make too much of the noticing, which was its own kind of progress. Outside on Route 64, a school bus made its way down the highway with the particular lumbering authority of vehicles that had the right of way and knew it. Colt watched it pass and thought about the elementary school on Caldwell Street and the teacher's parking lot, where a woman with a 12-year record of paying attention had been waiting with a sealed envelope for someone who would actually come. He thought about Nora Hayes waking up this morning in Ruth Calloway's house, in a room that was not the apartment behind the shop, in a bed that was not the bed where someone had been putting things in her food so she would sleep. Waking up to the smell of sweet tea starting and the particular morning sounds of someone else's house, which were always slightly wrong and always slightly comforting in the wrongness, because the wrongness meant you were somewhere different from where you had been. He hoped she slept late. He hoped she slept as late as she wanted and that nobody came to wake her up, and that the first thing she experienced on this specific morning was simply the absence of the thing that had been there every morning before it. Sometimes the absence of a thing was everything. Chad Weston had been a deputy sheriff in Millhaven for 6 years. He had grown up in this town. He had gone to school at the same elementary school where Miriam Cross now taught 4th grade. He had played baseball in the same league that Boyd Weston now coached. He had attended First Baptist his entire life, had been baptized there at 11 years old, had sat in the same pew every Sunday with his father and his mother, and after his mother passed with his father alone. He understood in the abstract way that people understood things they had learned before they were old enough to examine them, that his father was an important man in Millhaven, that his father had relationships that extended through the county government and into the state government, and that these relationships produced outcomes. That when certain problems arose, you called Gerald Weston and the problems were managed. He had grown up watching this. He had grown up thinking it was how things worked. He had become a deputy sheriff partly because he believed in the law, and partly because his father thought it was a good idea, and partly because in a town the size of Millhaven, the available options were limited, and law enforcement was one of the better ones. He was good at the job, he was patient with people, and had a memory for faces and names, and he understood instinctively that most of the situations he responded to required de-escalation rather than force, and he was good at de-escalation. He had told himself across 6 years that being on the right side of his father's preferences and being on the right side of the law were the same thing, that his father's relationships and his father's management of situations was a kind of order-keeping that complemented rather than contradicted his own work. He had a daughter named Clara who was 9 years old. He had been thinking about Clara for much of the night. He was still thinking about her in the parking lot of Weston Auto at 11:30, when the federal agents were completing their processing of the scene and his father's car was pulling away, and 63 motorcycles were idling on Calder Street in the specific silence of people who had decided to stand witness. He thought about Clara at 9 years old with her specific laugh and her current intense interest in marine biology that would probably last approximately 6 weeks, and her habit of falling asleep on the couch during movies and having to be carried to bed by her mother. He thought about what it would mean for Clara to be in a house where someone was afraid of the person who was supposed to protect her. What it would cost Clara to learn, over a period of years, to fold her hands a certain way so they would stay still. What it would take from Clara to develop the specific, patient, exhausted watchfulness of a child who had learned that watching was the only option consistently available. He could not make the image hold. His mind rejected it as impossible. And then he understood, standing in the parking lot of Weston Auto at 11:30 on a Tuesday night in August, that the impossibility was the point, that the reason he could not make the image hold was the same reason he should not have let it be possible for any other child in any house in Millhaven or anywhere else. He had told himself a story for 6 years about his father's management being a kind of order-keeping. He stood in the parking lot and understood that the story was over. He did not know yet what came after the story. He did not know what he was going to do tomorrow morning, or what the conversation with his father's attorney was going to look like, or how the department was going to handle the fact that Deputy Chad Weston had known things he had not acted on. He did not know any of the specific shape of what came next. He knew that it was going to cost him. He knew that what it cost him was considerably less than what it had already cost a 7-year-old girl to live in a house on the east side of Millhaven while he had been telling himself stories about order keeping. He watched the federal vehicle carrying his father disappear around the corner at the end of Calder Street. Then he walked to his own vehicle and sat in it for a long time in the parking lot with the window down and the night air coming in, and he thought about Clara, and he thought about what kind of man he was going to be for the rest of his life. He did not think about his father. He had spent enough time thinking about his father. Ruth Calloway had lived on the same street as Boyd Weston for 11 years. She had moved there after her husband passed, downsizing from the house they had shared for 34 years into something more manageable, something she could maintain alone without the specific heartbreak of watching a house that was built for 2 people accommodate only one. She had learned the street the way you learn any street when you lived on it alone and paid attention, which was gradually and completely. She knew which neighbors left their porch lights on all night and which turned them off at 10. She knew which dogs would bark at a car and which would bark at a person and which would bark at nothing in particular because they were old and confused and had earned the right. She knew the rhythms of the houses around her the way you know the rhythms of things you have been watching for a long time. She had started watching the Weston house in the way she watched it now approximately 14 months ago when she had seen Nora sitting on the front steps at 7 in the morning on a school day in November, wearing a jacket that was too thin for the temperature and eating a granola bar with the focused efficiency of someone who was not sure when the next meal was coming. Ruth had brought her a cup of hot chocolate. Nora had accepted it with both hands and said thank you in the voice of a child who had been taught to say thank you but had not often had occasion to mean it, and then had meant it, and the meaning of it had been visible on her face for approximately 3 seconds before she put it away. Ruth had called the county line the following week. She had explained what she had seen, not just the jacket and the granola bar, but the accumulated weight of 14 months of watching, the way Nora moved through the street, the way she watched the door of the shop when Boyd's truck was in the lot, the way she could go from ordinary to invisible, in the time it took a car to turn onto the block. The county line had thanked her for her call and told her that there were existing proceedings and that if she had specific concerns about imminent danger, she should call 911. She had called the county line again 4 months later. The county line had told her the same thing. She had gone back to watching. She did not know what else to do. She was 72 years old and had no legal standing and no professional authority and no connection to the people who were supposed to be handling this. She had 2 hands and a working phone and the ability to pay attention, and that was what she had. She had used what she had. When the federal placement worker had called at midnight and asked if she was willing to have Nora come to her house that night, she had said yes before the sentence was finished. She had gotten up and put the kettle on and made up the spare room with the quilt that had been her daughter's when her daughter was Nora's age, and she had sat at the kitchen table and waited. The car had pulled up at 1:15 in the morning. Nora had gotten out with the paramedic and stood on the sidewalk and looked at the house for a moment with those pale, serious eyes that Ruth had been watching from across the street for over a year. Then Nora had walked up to the door, and Ruth had opened it, and Nora had come inside and stood in the kitchen and looked at the kettle on the stove. "Is that for me?" Nora said. "Yes," Ruth said. Nora sat at the kitchen table. Ruth made the tea and poured it into a mug and set it in front of her and sat down across from her and did not say anything for a while. Nora held the mug in both hands. They sat together at the kitchen table in the 1 in the morning, quiet of a house that was not the apartment behind the shop, and the tea steamed between them. And outside the storm had finished, and the street was quiet in the specific way that streets get quiet after a long rain, when everything that was going to happen has happened, and what remains is just the world going about its business in the dark. "You can sleep as late as you want," Ruth said. Nora looked at her. "As late as I want, as late as you want," Ruth said. "There is nowhere you need to be." Nora looked back at the tea. She appeared to be processing this information carefully, comparing it against something. "Okay," she said finally. She finished the tea, and Ruth walked her to the spare room and showed her the lamp and the extra blanket at the foot of the bed and the bathroom down the hall, and Nora stood in the doorway of the spare room and looked at the quilt on the bed. "That's a nice quilt," Nora said. "It was my daughter's," Ruth said. "Where is she now?" "She lives in Nashville," Ruth said. She has 2 children of her own. Nora nodded as if this information fit into a picture she was assembling. Okay, she said again. She went into the spare room and Ruth pulled the door almost closed, not all the way, just almost leaving a strip of light from the hallway falling across the floor. And she went back to the kitchen and sat at the table and listened to the house settle and did not go back to bed for a long time. She was still sitting at the table when the first light came through the window at 5:30. She put the kettle on again. She thought she might make sweet tea when the girl woke up, whenever that was, however late she needed. She thought that was probably the right thing to start with. Connie Pruitt drove home from the scene on Calder Street at 12:30 in the morning and sat in her car in her driveway for 20 minutes before going inside. She had 2 kids of her own, a boy named Marcus, who was 14 and currently going through a phase of communicating exclusively in single syllables, and a girl named Denise, who was 11 and had recently discovered that she had opinions about everything and was not shy about expressing them. They were at their father's house this week, the alternating weeks having been the arrangement for 3 years now. And Connie always experienced the alternating weeks as a particular combination of relief and a low-grade ache that did not fully resolve until they were back. She sat in the car and thought about them. She thought about what it would mean for Marcus or Denise to be in a situation where they needed to sit in the corner of a room with their knees drawn up and their hands folded to keep them still. She thought about what it would mean for either of them to learn the lesson that Nora Hayes had apparently learned, which was that telling someone about a bad thing happening was something you did, knowing that nothing would come of it. That you did it anyway because the alternative was not telling anyone, and that you folded the hope up small enough to fit in your chest where it would not show. She could not make it fit. Her mind would not accommodate the image, which was she understood the privilege of a parent whose children had not had to learn that particular lesson. The privilege of the ordinary. She had called the county line 8 months ago and been told that a visit would be arranged. A visit had been arranged. She had watched the visit happen through the window of the diner, had watched Boyd Weston's truck pull up, and Boyd help Nora out of the passenger side and walk her inside. She had watched through the plate glass as Boyd made the woman with the clipboard welcome, had watched the ease of a man performing competence and warmth for an audience he knew was evaluating him. She had watched Nora sit in the booth nearest the door and not eat the piece of pie Boyd had ordered for her. She had thought about saying something to the clipboard woman as she left, had stood at the counter with a pot of coffee and considered it and then not done it because she did not know what she would say. That would sound like more than the word of a waitress against the word of a man who coached youth baseball and attended First Baptist and had just spent 40 minutes being charming and helpful to a county official. She had poured coffee and not said anything and gone home that night and not slept and gone back to work the next morning. That was 8 months ago. She had not known what else to do. She had done the things she was supposed to do, and the things she was supposed to do had not worked, and she did not have access to the things that might work instead. She had not known that the things that might work instead were going to arrive on a Harley on a Tuesday night and order just coffee in a voice like gravel in a concrete mixer. She sat in her car in her driveway at 12:30 in the morning and thought about that. She thought about the specific quality of the silence in the diner when Colt Briggs had walked through the door, the involuntary collective quiet of a room that had decided without discussion to make itself smaller. She had seen that happen many times across 11 years, had learned to read it as a particular kind of signal about a particular kind of person. She had also watched him wrap both hands around a coffee mug. Both hands. Not one hand with a casual grip the way men held mugs when they were comfortable and had somewhere to be. 2 hands the way you held something when you needed the warmth of it, when the holding was the point as much as the coffee. She had seen that too and had made the assessment she made about people who came in alone at 9 on a Tuesday with 2 hands around a mug and nothing to say. She had left the carafe within reach. 11 years of reading people across a counter. She got out of the car and went inside and checked the locks and went to bed. She did not sleep immediately. She lay in the dark and thought about a 7-year-old girl waking up tomorrow morning somewhere that was not the apartment behind the shop. And she thought about the county line call she had made 8 months ago and the one she had not made in the months between. All the individual Tuesday nights when Nora had sat in booth 9 with her hands folded and Connie had brought her a glass of water and not said anything because there was nothing to say that she had not already said into a phone 8 months ago with no result. She thought about all of that Then she let it be what it was, which was the past, and she went to sleep.